Mesdames et messieurs, la séance est ouverte. L'ordre du jour appelle la présentation et la discussion du rapport de M. Tony Lloyd, au nom de la Commission des questions politiques et de la démocratie, sur les conséquences pour l'Europe et la région de la situation en Afghanistan, avec le document 15-381. Je vous rappelle que nous devrons en avoir terminé avec l'examen de ce texte, vote inclus, à 11 heures. Nous devrons donc interrompre la liste des orateurs vers 10h30 afin de pouvoir entendre la réplique de la Commission et de procéder au vote nécessaire. Le rapporteur dispose de 7 minutes pour la présentation de son rapport et de 3 minutes pour répondre aux oratrices et orateurs à la fin de la discussion générale. Monsieur le rapporteur, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Madam President. Can I just begin by making this very obvious point that all of us will remember forever those graphic pictures of people fleeing for their lives, attempting to hang on to the bottom of planes taking off from the airport in Kabul, only to fall to their death. Those pictures will live with us for, I think, forever. But those pictures are important because we will not see the pictures of the many-headed crisis that Afghanistan and its people now face. We know that that crisis is about human rights, it's about economic collapse, it's about humanitarian needs, it's about the possibility of drugs becoming once again an issue, of terrorism, and of course, all of those as potential drivers for further flows of refugees. So I think it's self-evident if we look at the situation in Afghanistan. Look, for example, at the human rights crisis. We won't see this on our television screens. This will be something that we may read about, but we won't see it. Look, the young girl who doesn't get to school, the young man who is thought to be gay, who comes under attack in his community, those are the real human rights dimensions of this crisis. We know this will happen. We know things are already going wrong in Afghanistan. The economic crisis is there. We know there's a financial collapse is possible. We know that worklessness is a real and major issue. And of course, the consequence of that, the economic collapse, is humanitarian collapse. We know there are 1 million children already suffering such severe malnutrition, doctors fear they may die. 1 million children. We won't see those on our cameras. We know that 93% of the population of Afghanistan is malnourished. We don't see that again on our cameras. Or take health. We know that health professionals are not working, sometimes because they've fled, sometimes because they're not paid. But one way or the other, only 1 in 5 of some of the medical facilities are properly, fully functional. That's the reality of health on the ground. And of course, this is a community and a population that needs that health care. So the humanitarian crisis is already there, and we need to do something about it. But of course, behind those crises, human rights, humanitarian, economic, what do we say to the farmer who says, if I'm going to feed my children, I will grow poppies? I will be part of that drugs industry. Let's not be surprised. Let's not approve it, but let's not be surprised if we offer no other choices. And if we pauperise people, don't be too surprised if they become politically radicalised, and that radicalism can lead to terror and to terrorism. Maybe in Afghanistan itself, attacks upon the present government, maybe externally in the region or in the wider world. These are real issues that we have to face. And we do also face, as a result of all that, the possibility that the 3 million plus people who are already internally displaced in Afghanistan, join the 2 million odd Afghans who are already refugees outside of Afghanistan, in a further wave, massive wave of refugees. And of course, Afghanistan itself faces the possibility of conflict and even civil war. Now, I hope that doesn't take place, but it could. So we have a pragmatic interest and we have a moral interest. Certainly countries like mine, Madam President, that were involved for 20 years in Afghanistan, we have a moral imperative to do something about this. And of course, it's difficult for us to talk to the Taliban, but we've got to have engagement, and it's how we have that engagement. So the first thing we've got to do is to say that the moral authority comes from the United Nations. The United Nations and its agencies are already in Afghanistan. They're on the ground. And being there on the ground, they are there to help with the humanitarian work that we've got happening on. Because we can't say there's conditionality in feeding children. We can't say there's conditionality in making sure that women who are pregnant, people generally who need medical care, have that rationed. That must be unconditional. But of course, when we go beyond the UN and its agencies, the UN, they must have unhindered access. The refugee programs, the Afghan mission, the UN Afghan mission, the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, etc. These all must have unhindered access into Afghanistan. That is the condition for humanitarian aid. But when we come beyond that, of course, we do need to have a real conversation with the Taliban about what kind of assistance we're prepared to provide, because it's in our interest, again, pragmatically, if we don't want to see refugees, morally, to make sure that we engage with the kind of development work that will make Afghanistan a secure place. And that does mean, though, a very clear message to the Taliban government that, yes, our help would be there, but it's got to be conditional. And it's got to be conditional on the respect for human rights, the rejection of terrorism, the formation of an inclusive political process, the provision of unhindered access to the United Nations, and of course, the practical facilitation of evacuation processes. But we also need as well to look what lies beyond Afghanistan itself. And in the few moments that I have left, let me just say, Madam President, I think the imperative for us all is to look at what obligations we have in terms of refugees in the wider world. My own country is committed to taking in 20,000 refugees, but I must say to my own country, that represents one refugee for every 8 hours that the British were there during the 20 years of involvement in Afghanistan. This is a very small number. The world, particularly the world that was engaged in Afghanistan, must stand up and help. And of course, that's not unconditional, but we nevertheless have got to be there to help, because if we're not there to help, we will see a refugee crisis, and a refugee crisis that will place the burden on the poorest people in the countries already under stress. So there's a major issue around refugees. We've got also to look at the position of other countries in the region, in Central Asia, in Pakistan. Pakistan I know well. Central Asia, we as a Council of Europe should engage with, because they will come under pressure. We have a lot to gain by working together on Afghanistan. We have a lot to gain by engaging carefully and cautiously with the Taliban, with conditionality, but nevertheless a recognition that we have a common interest in a stable Pakistan to prevent drugs, to prevent terrorism, to prevent the flow of refugees. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci, Monsieur le rapporteur. Dans la discussion générale maintenant, la parole est à Monsieur Graf pour les conservateurs.
Ja, danke, Frau Vorsitzende, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Vorweg möchte ich mich bedanken beim Berichterstatter Sir Tony Lloyd und auch dem Ausschuss und letztlich auch der Plenarversammlung, dass es möglich gemacht wurde, dass wir heute bereits, also kurz nach dem Zusammenbruch in Afghanistan, über ein wichtiges Thema, das uns noch viele Jahre beschäftigen wird, auch hier in Europa, zu diskutieren. Und dieser Bericht ist eine erste Bestandaufnahme, würde ich einmal so meinen, und legt auch taxativ dar, wie die letzten 20 Jahre in Afghanistan gearbeitet wurde. Wenn auch keine Lösungen im wirklichen Sinne angeboten werden, ist es eine gute Gelegenheit, hier in diesem Hohen Hause auch darüber zu diskutieren. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, wir müssen uns eingestehen, dass nach der militärischen Katastrophe die humanitäre und soziale Katastrophe bereits eingetreten ist, und nicht zwar erst im August dieses Jahres, sondern schon beginnend mit Beginn im Kampf oder im Krieg gegen den Terrorismus, der ja mit dem Exodus des Osama bin Laden letztlich ein Ende fand, aber im Land weiterhin die Kämpfe stattgefunden haben bis zuletzt, bis zu den schrecklichen Bildern, die auch schon angezeigt wurden und gezeigt wurden. Alle Ziele, dem Land Frieden, Verfassung, Demokratie, Rechtsstaatlichkeit, Menschenrechte und so weiter zu bringen, wurden zu 100% in den letzten 20 Jahren und auch davor verfehlt. Wir haben eine Situation, die wir vorfinden, dass wir ein Gegenüber haben, das die Scharia ohne Wenn und Aber in der fundamentalsten und extremsten Form als Landesgesetz einführen wird. Wir alle wissen, was das für die Menschen dort zum Großteil bedeuten wird. Ich glaube, wir haben selbstverständlich die Verpflichtung als Europa insgesamt, aber auch in der Welt Hilfe zu leisten. Nur müssen wir die Verantwortung und die Kompetenz auch zusammenführen, wie ich meine. Jetzt gilt es für die kriegsführenden Staaten allen voran, vor allem für die USA, die Verantwortung auch zu übernehmen bei der Lösung der humanitären Probleme. Sowohl finanziell, aber auch durch die Aufnahme von gefährdeten Menschen, Männer, Frauen und Kinder. Der bisherige Beitrag der USA lassen Schlimmes befürchten. Hunderttausende Afghanen und Afghaninnen wurden bei Verbündeten geparkt und es scheint so, dass die USA nur wenige Ausgesuchte übernimmt und Hunderttausende Schicksale den Verbündeten überlässt. Österreich ist auch namentlich angeführt in diesem Bericht. Undifferenziert noch etwas möchte ich dazu sagen. Wir haben zwar teilgenommen an der Mission mit 2 Beobachtern, militärischen Beobachtern und wurden undifferenziert in diese Liste aufgenommen.
Merci.
Österreich hat auch schon einen Beitrag geleistet in diesem Zusammenhang und bereits 50.000 afghanische Flüchtlinge aufgenommen. Insofern verwundert es mich, dass Großbritannien nur 10.000 aufnehmen möchte. Im Vergleich dazu müsste Amerika 1,8 Millionen Flüchtlinge aufnehmen und Deutschland 500.000. Es gibt viel zu tun bei der Lösung und es gilt vor allem, die kriegsführenden Staaten daran zu erinnern, nunmehr auch ihren Beitrag zu leisten. Dankeschön.
Merci. Ce serait bien qu'on arrive dans le temps imparti pour les oratrices et les orateurs. La parole est maintenant à Madame Castel pour le groupe LaGUE. C'est à vous.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We want to congratulate the rapporteur on this balanced report. Our group will support it. The occupation of Afghanistan in 2001 showed a government in decay. The investment in military premises and huge corruption has left the population in an ongoing humanitarian emergency. This has showed democracy cannot be exported by military means, as well as the failure of a model of foreign intervention. Surprisingly, the European Union had, until now, considered the Afghanistan is a safe country where asylum seekers could be returned to. On Tuesday, testimonies from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Independent Afghan Commission showed a real civilian slaughter. Women's rights severely damaged, no education and no work, enforced displacement of ethnic minorities, ideological killings and kidnappings, delivery of justice suspended, no judges and lawyers hiding, NGOs forced to underground operating, 100 media channels interrupted, brutal techniques like amputation or stoning used again, internet blackouts, in some, no contact on the ground, and a widespread climate of fear that makes monitoring fragile but essential. Colleagues, this is not a wait-and-see scenario. We cannot stay on the sidelines when a terrorist organization engages in international crimes. We play a crucial role in ensuring that our governments are accounted for. And it is cynical to secure the safety of our own nationals alone. For the above, our group proposes that Council of Europe member states should guarantee safe passage and evacuation for refugee population, respecting the principle of non-refoulement. Propose asylum officers in countries of origin, facilitate visas, and ensure resettlement from neighboring countries to member states. Condition 8, to push the regime to respect women's rights, ensuring education and employment, increase investment of humanitarian assistance, and push the governments to fund a fact-finding mechanism within the United Nations Human Rights Council. Thank you, colleagues, for this report. From our group, we encourage you to vote it, and the rapporteur to keep monitoring and reporting on these issues. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame. Alors, pour le groupe des socialistes, nous avons en ligne Madame Roanne Gustafsson. C'est à vous, Madame. Vous pouvez prendre la parole.
Thank you, Madam President. This is a very important debate and report, because what is happening in Afghanistan should be of a great concern for everyone and every institution that stands up for human rights. When the former Taliban regime fell in 2001, the country was in ruins after occupation, civil war, oppression, and gross mismanagement. The next 20 years did indeed include violence and many setbacks, but also indisputable successes. The number of children in school has risen since 2001 from about 500,000 to an estimated 7 to 8 million, of which 40% are girls. For the first time in the country's history, a generation has emerged where the majority can read and write. But also the progresses made on women's rights. Women have for the past 20 years gained access to higher education. They have been a crucial part in the workforce, especially in the development of the educational and the healthcare system in the country. They have been included in the political landscape, and they have been an important voice for vulnerable groups. The vast majority of the Afghan population see these progresses. They have sacrificed a lot for it, and they want to see the progress continue. But they need the support of the outside world. We are already witnessing how the Taliban prevent girls from attending school and how women are absent from their workplaces. We see that minorities are afraid of increased oppression, and being an LGBT person in Afghanistan today can be a death sentence. Madam President, Afghanistan is, unless the outside world acts now, facing an imminent state collapse and a total humanitarian catastrophe which no aid organization can compensate for. This would create a perfect ground for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups in the region. Several member countries of Council of Europe have been involved in Afghanistan during the past 20 years. They have contributed to rebuilding the country through humanitarian aid. They have been a part of the military forces for upholding the security and peace in the country. Now we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to make sure that the past 20 years don't go to waste. Our group urgently calls on every political representative to internationally join forces and put pressure on Taliban to comply with their declaration to respect equality. We must keep the Taliban accountable for every backlash on human rights. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame. Je donne maintenant la parole à Madame Mezentseva pour le groupe PPE.
Thank you, dear colleagues, dear President. We do know that the rapid collapse of Afghanistan government forces and the Taliban's seizure of power have shocked the whole Europe, the whole continent, and led to an intense debate about the implications for our European policy. Europe definitely cannot shield itself from the trouble spots around it, because this is our neighborhood. And if we no longer commit to stabilizing our neighborhood policy, the instability will come to our homes. The evacuation of civilians from Afghanistan was the first example of our pragmatic and joint engagement with the Taliban. With the evacuation of citizens from our member states, and to extent possible of Afghan nations who have cooperated with our member states and their families, has been conducted as a matter of priority. The brilliant special operations of many states, including Ukraine, and the Directorate of the Ministry of Defense did not leave anyone different across the world, and we have seen it in the global media. Thanks to the special operations from across Europe, hundreds of people, citizens of Ukraine and our member states, and Afghans, children, women, people with disabilities, elderly, could escape the inevitable abuse, torture, and their possible deaths. In the longer term, more Afghans may well aim to come to Europe to join their family members who are living already there and in our countries, so that they can escape the conditions in the refugee camps. And it is up to us, dear colleagues, and some EU states would not to lead the way here and to do better that it did happen in the case of Syria, unfortunately. We will need to coordinate with Afghan's neighboring states at an early stage, supporting them financially, logistically, to keep their borders open and to provide shelter for those fleeing the Taliban regime. A young female journalist forced into hiding in Afghanistan had one request to those listening around the world, and her quote was, "Please pray for me." Her life had been obliterated overnight. She could no longer write under her own name. She didn't know if she'd see her family again or whatever she'd even survive. Dear colleagues, I have myself been receiving many messages from the airport when the Afghan people who are having very, very close ties with their families across Europe were screaming and asking for help. We do know that the urgent need for rescue of them is there, and it is crucial for us to increase the humanitarian and international protection for migration and security. We can do it together. Merci, le Président.
Merci Madame. Je donne maintenant la parole pour le dernier groupe inscrit, Monsieur Lenné pour le groupe ADLE. C'est à vous.
Merci Madame la Présidente, mes chers collègues. Il y a maintenant plus d'un mois, nous avons tous assisté au retrait précipité et non concerté des troupes américaines et aux scènes de panique et d'horreur qu'il a provoquées. Après ces semaines de chaos, nous devons faire face à une réalité désolante. Les talibans sont à nouveau maîtres de l'Afghanistan. Cette situation nouvelle, bien que prévisible, doit faire réfléchir l'Europe et la conduire à agir. Nous devons faire face ensemble aux conséquences de cette évolution politique. Pour commencer, la non-reconnaissance de ce régime taliban apparaît comme une évidence. La communauté internationale et, a fortiori, l'Europe, ne doit pas accorder de légitimité à ce régime qui a pris le pouvoir par la force et qui se maintient par la violence. Le choix de la violence se fait alors que le pays traverse une crise économique et alimentaire très grave. Le programme alimentaire mondial évoque des risques de famine pour plus d'un tiers de la population, manquant cruellement d'eau potable. À défaut de pouvoir dialoguer avec un gouvernement démocratique, l'Europe doit donc maintenir des liens avec la société civile afghane. Elle doit la soutenir dans sa lutte pour les droits fondamentaux, où les femmes sont particulièrement actives, mais aussi les journalistes, les artistes et les intellectuels. L'Europe doit aussi, via ses ONG, soutenir la population afghane en matière d'alimentation, de santé, d'accès à l'eau, d'approvisionnement ou encore d'éducation. L'Europe a un savoir-faire en matière d'aide humanitaire. Elle doit le mettre à profit de l'Afghanistan. Nous connaissons les méthodes talibanes et leur opposition à la science et à l'Occident. Ainsi, le soutien humanitaire que nous fournirons et qui doit être notre priorité pourrait ne pas suffire pour créer des conditions de vie décentes pour tous les Afghans. Certains arriveront donc en Europe. et nous devons alors harmoniser nos politiques d'accueil et faire preuve de solidarité. Notre groupe politique estime que la stratégie européenne pour l'Afghanistan doit s'articuler ainsi. Pas de reconnaissance du régime taliban, une aide humanitaire renforcée pour faire face à la grave crise que traverse le pays, un accueil décent des ressortissants afghans qui arriveraient en Europe. Mes chers collègues, une stratégie européenne est nécessaire pour ne pas laisser l'Afghanistan menacé par la famine aux seules mains de l'obscurantisme, en maintenant l'espoir d'un Afghanistan libre et démocrate. Je vous remercie.
Merci, monsieur. Nous continuons maintenant avec la liste des orateurs et je donne la parole à Lord Fuchs pour le Royaume-Uni.
President, can I, like Laura Castell, congratulate Tony Lloyd on what is a really very well-balanced report, all the more remarkable considering he was only appointed as rapporteur less than 2 days ago. It really is an excellent report. Madam President, many millions of words have been written or said in relation to Afghanistan. And you wonder if there's anything new to add. Mind you, that doesn't normally stop politicians repeating and adding to it, and I'm no exception. However, today I just want to make 3 quick points. First, it's only too easy to criticize both the Western intervention and the speedy withdrawal. And as Tony Lloyd said, there's pictures of people clinging to the aircraft were very poignant indeed. However, the very fact that we're now talking about retaining, about preserving the gains that have been made, particularly for women and children and girls' education, shows that the intervention has improved the situation, and at some cost of lives, particularly American and British lives. So what we need to talk about now, need to concentrate on, is how we can preserve these gains. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is to underline what Tony Lloyd says in his report, the importance of the central role of the United Nations and its agencies. That's what the UN was set up for. That's why it has agencies. And we should put more faith, more trust, and more support to the UN and its agencies. And this is a particular area at which they can be positive. And the third point I want to make is to make a special plea on behalf of women judges who have played a particular part in helping improve the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. There are now 220 women judges whose lives are in danger. And we need, our countries need, and in particular, I urge the United Kingdom government, and indeed other governments, but in my case, my government, to do everything they can to protect the interests of female judges. They've protected women and children over the last 20 years. Now it's our job to help to protect them. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à monsieur Stier de Croatie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear colleagues. The first thing that we have to realize about the situation in Afghanistan is that the strategic decision of the United States to withdraw its troops has probably less to do with Afghanistan itself and far more to do with China and the containment measures envisaged by Washington and carried out by US institutions in a continuing effort, regardless of the fact who is in the White House. Now, since resources are limited, even for the United States, they needed to be shifted from Afghanistan to the primary strategic goal of US foreign policy, and that is this new US-China dialectic that is already reordering international relations in all their dimensions. Now, in such a geopolitical environment, the situation in Afghanistan is currently tackled and handled by the United Nations. However, we can also notice and stress that some members of the Council of Europe, in particular Turkey and Russia, already play and will probably continue to play a significant geopolitical role in the area and in interaction with relevant regional and global actors. The European Union also has envisaged a platform for dialogue with the neighbors of Afghanistan. Now, regarding this parliamentary assembly, I share the good intentions described in Article 11 of the draft resolution, although somehow I doubt about any possible concrete effect on the Taliban. I also share the disposition of Article 8, the one calling on the member states of the Council of Europe, and I already mentioned some of them that have a particular role in the area. Finally, I fully back the support expressed in the resolution to the United Nations in its endeavor with regard to the situation in Afghanistan and the protection of human rights, in particular those of women and children. And let me conclude also by thanking the rapporteur for his work. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Alors, nous allons là avoir quelques personnes en ligne. Donc, je leur demande déjà de se préparer. Il s'agit de monsieur Ecker, monsieur Christiansen et monsieur Fassino. Je donne maintenant la parole à monsieur Ecker pour la Turquie. C'est à vous, monsieur. Alors, le temps qui se reconnecte, peut-être monsieur Christiansen pour la Suède. Est-ce que vous êtes là? Elle n'est pas là. Monsieur Ecker est là? Alors, on va... Qui est là? Monsieur Fassino? Allez, monsieur Fassino d'Italie, la parole est à vous.
Grazie Presidente. In 3 minuti voglio concentrare su poche questioni. Ringrazio il collega Lloyd e condivido la sua relazione. Il tema mi sembra questo: isolare o interloquire con i talebani. È evidente che guardando quello che i talebani stanno facendo, il primo istinto sarebbe quello di isolare. Però isolare significherebbe dare mano libera ai talebani sulla società afghana, rendere ancora più deboli quelli che si stanno battendo con grande coraggio per i loro diritti e consegnare l'Afghanistan alla Cina, alla Russia e a paesi che sono assai meno sensibili ai temi dei diritti umani. Io penso che quindi sia obbligatorio cercare di interloquire con le autorità talebane, anche se naturalmente è molto difficile. Interloquire per aiutare intanto coloro che si battono per i loro diritti dentro l'Afghanistan, interloquire per realizzare un aiuto umanitario che soccorra le popolazioni di fronte alla grave crisi che si sta per determinare, e naturalmente però l'interlocuzione deve essere legata ad alcune condizioni. La prima condizione mi pare quella di che i talebani riconoscano e rispettino alcuni diritti fondamentali che sono irrinunciabili per ogni persona, in qualsiasi luogo abiti, qualsiasi sia il colore della sua pelle, qualsiasi Dio preghi. E questi diritti fondamentali sono il diritto di studiare, il diritto di lavorare, il diritto di esprimere le proprie opinioni, il diritto di vivere la propria religione senza paura. Quindi io penso che ci sono dei diritti fondamentali per i quali noi dobbiamo batterci e chiedere ai talebani di rispettare questi diritti e riconoscerli e rispettarli, facendo di questo la condizione per un'interlocuzione con le autorità talebane. La seconda condizione mi pare quella di chiedere che ci sia un governo inclusivo, un governo che rappresenti tutta la società afghana e non soltanto i talebani come oggi. Tra l'altro oggi abbiamo un governo che rappresenta anche i talebani più radicali, che non rappresenta neanche tutto l'universo talebano. Quindi un governo inclusivo è un'altra condizione che dobbiamo porre. E la terza condizione è che l'Afghanistan non torni a essere un santuario delle organizzazioni terroristiche. Questo rischio c'è se si guarda le complicità che ci sono tra alcuni settori talebani e Al-Qaeda e l'ISIS. Quindi queste 3 condizioni: rispetto dei diritti, in primo luogo delle donne, governo inclusivo, no a qualsiasi legame con copertura o complicità con il terrorismo, sono 3 condizioni che noi dobbiamo porre con molta forza. Infine, il Consiglio d'Europa ha come finalità la tutela dei diritti e in Afghanistan appunto si stanno violando diritti fondamentali, diritti che durante la missione internazionale per 20 anni erano stati garantiti, e oggi c'è una società afghana molto più reattiva di 20 anni fa che non accetta la negazione e la violazione di quei diritti. E quindi noi dobbiamo mantenere un rapporto con la società civile afghana, con quei settori che si battono per i diritti, aiutarli, sostenerli, e da questo punto di vista ruolo centrale hanno certamente le Nazioni Unite nel far valere il peso delle Nazioni Unite per questi obiettivi. Grazie.
Merci. On reprend donc la liste dans l'ordre maintenant. Est-ce que M. Eckert de Turquie est en ligne? Oui, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. After the USA and NATO withdrew from Afghanistan, contrary to forecasts, unfortunately, Taliban controls the entire country since they were able to suppress the resistance in Panjshir Valley. However, the risk of internal conflict or uprising still exists, and there is a chance that it could lead to a civil war. Thus, the international community must closely monitor developments in Afghanistan. It is obvious that the government announced by Taliban on September 7 has failed to deliver on its promises of inclusivity. We should continue to underline the fact that long-term stability can only be achieved by establishing an inclusive and representative government. By doing that, I believe we should be realistic about the conditions in the country. Far-fetched recommendations to Taliban cannot bring about the expected results. We should give priority to the right of all Afghan people to live in safety, security with dignity in their country. Secondly, our priority should be to emphasize the need to prevent and combat terrorist organizations such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda. We should give clear message to Taliban government to this end. In this context, the prevention of illegal production of trafficking of narcotic drugs constitute another vital issue. We need to take coordinated action in order to have an effective and sustainable response to these risks. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the declaration of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Cooperation Council of Turkic-speaking states made public following the meeting of 27 September in Istanbul, where all these points and calls for coherent messages and actions are emphasized. And I would like to thank the rapporteur for his work. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Merci, messieurs. Avant de passer la parole à monsieur Christiansen, j'avais sur ma liste Madame Le Guy-Ballois. Est-ce qu'elle est là? Non. Donc, je passe la parole à monsieur Christiansen de Suède. Vous avez la parole, monsieur.
Until the dust settles, applies more readily than in the present-day Afghanistan. An old new dictatorial regime, that of the Taliban, is back in fearsome rule after a 20-year break. A government that is unprepared and given an impression of confusion and incompetence. Meanwhile, the previous government has been dissolved, and its protectors, the Western Alliance led by the US, had to withdraw in haste. The food situation is desperate. Winter is approaching. A deadly enemy, the Islamic State, is active in the country. The country's neighbors are jockeying for position, even as their aims and prospects are difficult to foresee. Meanwhile, rising political tension in the region and beyond adds further complexity to the Afghan situation. It is therefore to the credit of our assembly that we have chosen not to wait until, quote, the dust settles before taking up this urgent issue today. And true enough, already certain trends can be spotted in European capitals when it comes to short-term action. Humanitarian relief, especially food and medicine, is in the starting blocks. Fuel is mobilized for winter heating and regional transport. Taliban supports of continued access by girls and women to education and professional life is being informally pleaded. On the diplomatic level, Western contacts with neighboring states are reported in order to support inner stability in Afghanistan. The list is not complete, but the overriding interest of Europe at this stage will be to carry out such actions with both delicacy and tenacity in order to help the population at large. One final point, Madam President. Today's Afghanistan is different from the country the Taliban ruled 20 years ago. During the intervening 2 decades, a generation of young Afghans, very much including girls and women, have enjoyed qualified education and a much freer access to professional life. They loved it and are now forming a major silent but unhappy group in Afghan society. The Taliban will need this group and they know it. We on our side must do everything to support the oppressed, peacefully and perhaps discreetly, but stand by them we must, Madam President. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à Madame Geshevara-Zarieva de Bulgarie. Si elle est dans la salle, je ne l'ai pas vue, mais non. Donc, peut-être que monsieur Kairidis de Grèce. Non, il a dit non. Allez-y, monsieur. Pardon, je ne vous avais pas vu tout de suite.
Oui. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Yeah, one moment. I ask for the floor, Madam President, because I think it's important to talk about another aspect and learn the right lessons from the Afghan disaster here in Europe. We live in a new world of heightened tensions and geostrategic antagonisms. We in Europe have been too complacent for too long. If we were to continue in this path, we are bound to face new surprises closer to home, I believe. We are often full of big words, and I'm afraid our session this morning is no exception, trying to cover a sorrow reality. 2 things need to be first and foremost in mind, I believe. First, the Afghan disaster and the rapid collapse of the Kabul regime prove the need for a more robust and united geostrategically Europe. As valuable as our transatlantic ties are, we need more autonomy and a bigger footprint if we are not to spend all our time on how sorry we are for this or that. Secondly, what is our strength in this new, increasingly competitive and antagonistic, difficult world we live in? Our common values that bring us together, that are the basis of our solidarity. The biggest threat for our standing in the world comes from those among us who want Europe to forget and set aside its values as a beacon of freedom, democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law. We need to be strong. And to be strong, we need to be free and democratic. In the meantime, in the spirit of the excellent report, which I commend, we must engage on the basis of clear conditionality with the Taliban regime now in Afghanistan, provide the necessary humanitarian aid and engage the region overall. But also, we must persist as much as we can on the difficult task of building up our credibility internationally, which is not done by words, but by deeds and hard but right choices. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne maintenant la parole à monsieur Kislyak de la Fédération de Russie, qui devrait être en ligne normalement. Oui. C'est à vous, monsieur Kislyak.
Président, Я хотел бы прежде всего сказать, что темы, такие как ситуация в Афганистане, требуют куда более обдуманного и серьезного разговора, чем позволяет формат urgent debate. Потому что мы говорим о серьезных событиях, которые отражают происходящее в мире и имеют последствия для многих из нас, представленных в этой организации. Я не буду повторять озабоченности тем, что сейчас складывается, как сейчас складывается ситуация в Афганистане, потому что многое из того, что говорили мои коллеги, мы полностью разделяем, но возникают более серьезные вопросы. Первое. А мы понимаем, результатом чего сложилась эта ситуация? Я думаю, что надо признать, что попытки силой навязывать демократию европейского или западного типа в странах с абсолютно другой историей и культурой провалились полностью. Афганистан это продемонстрировал в самой полной мере. Обвальный конец военного присутствия США и их союзников там только это подтверждает. Теперь возникает вопрос, что же дальше? Как действовать дальше? Вот меня очень смущают попытки сформулировать подходы, которые другими невоенными средствами также пытались бы навязывать те же самые стандарты европейские или западные, которые присутствуют здесь, в стране, напоминаю, с другой историей, с другой культурой и с доминирующей другой религией. Господин Фасина, я думаю, правильно поставил вопрос, что мы планируем делать? Изолировать дальше Талибана или попытаться индейчить его и работать с ним, с тем, чтобы решать проблемы, которые там есть? Я не согласен с тем, что если мы оттолкнем Талибан, то он попадет в руки России, и это плохо. Кстати, напомню, что именно в результате организованного нами диалога, так называемого московского, был начат диалог с Талибаном, где господин американский представитель вел диалог о политическом урегулировании, именно благодаря дипломатическим усилиям России. Об этом, кстати, почему-то мы сегодня не очень помним. Но факт остается фактом, что нынешнее правительство Талибана по-прежнему не инклюзивно. По-прежнему требуется помощь им в том, чтобы сформулировать правительство, которое представляло бы все этнополитические силы страны, чтобы там была стабильность, которая позволила бы решать остальные проблемы. Мы разделяем важность усилий по предотвращению террористической угрозы, в том числе и распространение террористических элементов из Афганистана под видом беженцев в наши страны. Мы поддерживаем центральную роль ООН, и это правильно, то, что мы об этом говорим в проекте резолюции. Но мы не хотим, чтобы наши рекомендации или положения резолюции вылились в очередное навязывание элементов демократии, которые в Афганистане сегодня и сформулировать-то никто не может, не то что принять. Надо понимать, что нам надо с этим режимом работать, внимательно следить за тем, чтобы он выполнял обещания, которые он уже сделал, как-то намерение провести всеобщие выборы, всеобщую амнистию правительственным чиновникам, соблюдение права женщин, борьбу с производством наркотиков. Он подтверждал, что с афганской территории не должно исходить угроз безопасности третьим странам. Это задача первого ряда, и надо иметь взаимодействие с Талибаном, чтобы добиваться...
Merci, monsieur Kislyak. Il faut conclure.
И, да, я заканчиваю. И я очень хотел бы рекомендовать нашим коллегам быть очень осторожным, навязывая европейские нормы права человеческие в стране, которые...
Merci, monsieur. Il faut garder le temps imparti, s'il vous plaît. Merci, monsieur Kislyak. Ce serait bien qu'on garde quand même, je le redis, mais si vous pouviez avoir des propos qui durent dans les 3 minutes, ce serait très bien. Je donne maintenant la parole à monsieur Umerov pour l'Ukraine.
Dear President, esteemed colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude to the rapporteur for the truly challenging yet undoubtedly necessary work he has conducted on this matter. Ukrainians helped more than 700 people to leave Afghanistan, and I thank our Ministry of Defense and every service member from Ukraine and other countries who took part in evacuation operation. But this is not the end. Unfortunately, the worst might yet to come. The EU and PACE have to involve the Committee of Ministers of Council of Europe's special attention on the importance of including this issue in its agenda for developing further recommendations and solutions that could be done. The most immediate impact for Europe is humanitarian, given the likely growth of migrants from Afghanistan. Several thousands of Afghans have already fled their homeland. The UN says up to 500,000 Afghans could escape by the end of the year. The EU has to develop a step-by-step plan of support for migrants on food security, access for basic rights, followed by 2019-20 UN and NGO partners Regional Refugee and Resettlement Plan, 3RP, a 5.5 billion plan to support national efforts in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt and Iraq deal with the continuing impact of Syria crisis was done. The same should be done for Afghanistan. We have to be ready to offer asylum and protection and prepare ourselves for public service availability for refugees and enable them to integrate into our societies. Multi-sectoral, well-coordinated responses from our member states could strengthen the capacity of national systems to cope with the growth of refugees. Unfortunately, another threat is that Afghanistan used to be a ground for development of terroristic organizations. Many fear that Afghanistan will once again become a center for instability. This in return increases the risk of future threats. We need to discuss the possibility of creating a mechanism for European support and exchange information on possible threats. The solution on this may be creating a joint unified effort in support of resolving crisis that threatens to become regional or global problem. We must objectively assess the complex and dangerous situation that has developed in Afghanistan. There are nearly 40 million people in Afghanistan who need help. That's why the current status of Afghanistan is obliged to be discussed by the international community, especially in PACE. We constantly need to think about mechanisms and find joint solutions to help jointly operate, especially the critical infrastructure in Afghanistan, airports, borders, since people are coming, as well as we have to find temporary relationship solutions. When the countries of the democratic world completely close communication with problematic regions, the problem becomes more complicated in the future. We need Europe to involve in all possible solutions to help people of Afghanistan and region. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne maintenant la parole à monsieur Howell pour le Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, Madam President. We can spend as long as we like talking about the major political issues that the crisis in Afghanistan has generated. We can spend as long as we like analysing the threats of terrorism and all of that, and all of that can come to some good, I'm sure. But if we want to really understand the humanitarian crisis that is faced by the people of Afghanistan, let me give you a practical example of how a group of people have been affected. The rapporteur has already mentioned the plight of girls and women, and a number of other speakers have as well. Let me give you a practical example of how that has affected it. There is an organization, or there was an organization in Afghanistan called the Afghan Women's Orchestra. It came to my constituency in the UK, and it performed there to great applause with great professionalism. Its instruments have been smashed by the Taliban. They've been smashed by the Taliban because they don't like Western music. The girls themselves have been threatened with death, and many of them have had to be flown out in secret in order to save their own lives. In fact, the weekend before all of this happened, we received an email from them, a message from them saying, our lives are at risk, our future is at risk, we can no longer play, we need help. That is a perfect example of what the situation in Afghanistan is generating. It is a perfect example of where we need to help. And you know, the reaction from some people who heard my speech on this in the British House of Commons was to send me a number of emails. Were those emails supportive? No, they were not. They were totally misogynistic and full of hate mail for bringing up the case of women in Afghanistan when they said there are plenty of male interpreters who are equally at risk. But let me repeat again that this is a very good example of what is happening in Afghanistan. This is a really good example of the humanitarian crisis that many women and girls are facing there, and it is one that we have not properly addressed. The Russian delegate can speak of not trying to impose Western culture, but this was not the imposition of Western culture. This was something that was generated by the Afghans themselves and which we should support.
Merci, monsieur. La parole est à monsieur Gavan pour l'Irlande.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to welcome, for the most part, this report, and fair play to Tony for putting it together so quickly. But I have to say, there is something kind of fundamental missing. Call me old-fashioned if you will, but I think it's still wrong to invade other people's countries and occupy them for 20 years. I think we seem to have lost sight of that somehow here. We need to talk about responsibility when we talk about Afghanistan. A number of Council of Europe member states, as well as the US, are involved in the 20-year military occupation of that country. We've heard about the military deaths on US and British forces, and they are a tragedy. 2,455 US military were killed, 457 British service members. Compare that to the 50,000 civilians who've lost their lives during that 20-year occupation. And when we talk about terrorism, by all means, let's talk about the Taliban. But what do you describe? How do you describe that act of blowing up a family of 10 people with a drone strike? If it was a once-off, you could call it an accident. How many thousands of Afghanis have perished from US drone strikes over the last 20 years? We need to talk about that. We need to recognize that. Billions of taxpayers' money was spent on this disastrous campaign that was doomed to failure, which is not to say that many private corporations did not benefit handsomely from defence contracts during this time. The Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, declared that US policy in Afghanistan was a catastrophic failure. And he was right, of course. But unfortunately, this didn't stop successive Irish governments from supporting the war in Afghanistan via offering the use of Shannon Airport to US forces on their way back and forth to the war zone throughout the past 2 decades. So we in Ireland also carry a responsibility. Imperialist military ventures never end well for the people of the occupied countries concerned. And let's be clear, this invasion was never about women's rights. It was about Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Now we see the Taliban return to power, and there's no little irony in the fact that the Taliban are a direct descendant organisation from the Mujahideen, who the West were very happy to fund and support when they wanted to topple the People's Democratic Party government of Babrak Kamel, who did 40 years ago try and improve women's rights. So we must support the people of Afghanistan and their urgent needs, and I do support, broadly speaking, the recommendations in this report. The international community has a huge responsibility to all of those citizens of Afghanistan, and in particular to protect Afghan women and girls whose lives and human rights are now posed in extreme peril. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Gavan. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Bergeron du Canada, qui est en ligne. Vous pouvez prendre la parole.
Bonjour, chers collègues. La situation qui prévaut actuellement en Afghanistan est une crise de grande envergure. La reprise du pouvoir par les talibans, un groupe considéré comme terroriste au Canada, est extrêmement préoccupante et ce, à plusieurs égards. La rapidité avec laquelle ils ont progressé sur le territoire et se sont emparés de Kaboul doit assurément amener la communauté internationale à s'interroger sur l'efficacité des interventions extérieures, aussi longues et coûteuses puissent-elles être. Elle devra aussi s'interroger sur les façons de continuer, via le Programme alimentaire mondial, à nourrir quelques 14 millions d'Afghans aux prises avec l'insécurité alimentaire en raison de la sécheresse et des conflits prolongés. Il y a lieu de craindre, en plus, que ce nombre soit appelé à augmenter en raison de l'instabilité politique et socio-économique qui s'intensifie avec le retour au pouvoir des talibans. Celui-ci laisse également présager une importante régression au chapitre des droits de la personne, particulièrement des femmes et des jeunes filles, qu'on a déjà exclues de l'enseignement supérieur et des charges publiques. Et tandis que les pratiques d'un autre âge se sont peu à peu réintroduites à l'égard des femmes, qu'il s'agisse de leur confinement à des tâches ménagères ou des contraintes qui leur sont imposées, entre autres, au chapitre de la liberté de circulation, quand il n'est pas question du mariage de fillettes, plusieurs craignent littéralement pour leur vie. Et que dire des personnes déplacées qui, selon les Nations unies, seraient plus de 3,5 millions dans le pays, dont 630 000 seulement depuis le début de 2021, sans compter les 2,2 millions de personnes qui se seraient réfugiées dans les pays voisins. Or, l'effondrement du gouvernement afghan en août dernier a provoqué une nouvelle vague de déplacements en Afghanistan. Les États ayant pris part à des opérations dans le pays ont bien organisé un pont aérien afin d'évacuer leurs ressortissants et les Afghans ayant coopéré avec eux, mais plusieurs ont malheureusement dû être abandonnés sur place en raison des difficultés à rejoindre l'aéroport de Kaboul et de la précipitation du retrait étranger. Ces États, dont le Canada, ont bien sûr affirmé vouloir accueillir nombre de réfugiés afghans sur leur territoire, mais c'est sans compter la complexité de la situation sur le terrain et les obstacles considérables auxquels ces personnes sont confrontées pour pouvoir sortir d'Afghanistan. À titre d'exemple, le Canada a annoncé qu'environ 20 000 ressortissants afghans vulnérables pourraient s'établir sur son territoire, mais seulement 2 300 y sont parvenus à ce jour. Force est de constater qu'en dépit de la bonne volonté affichée, les évacuations qui se sont déroulées en août dernier ont été déficientes puisque des milliers de personnes sont toujours coincées en Afghanistan. Les États membres du Conseil de l'Europe doivent donc coopérer étroitement pour continuer de soutenir les ressortissants étrangers et afghans confrontés à des difficultés croissantes, tout en veillant à ce que le gouvernement des talibans ne puisse aucunement en tirer profit, mais aussi pour assurer une protection internationale aux demandeurs d'asile et réfugiés afghans et leur permettre de quitter le pays. Nous avons l'obligation de tout mettre en œuvre pour protéger ces personnes vulnérables, surtout les femmes, dont les droits ne sont désormais plus assurés et dont la vie est même parfois menacée. Enfin, comme l'ont déclaré les dirigeants du groupe des Sept, il faut faire en sorte que l'Afghanistan ne redevienne jamais le sanctuaire de terrorisme qu'il a été ou ne serve de nouveau de rampe de lancement pour les attentats terroristes menés dans d'autres pays. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne maintenant la parole à Madame Bardina d'Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, Madam President, in recent months we have seen how human rights and women's rights have been destroyed in Afghanistan. As it is mentioned in the report, the Taliban's return to power raises major concerns as regards the respect of human rights in Afghanistan, especially in areas such as women's rights. Within days, women's faces were hidden from the media, culture, education, and public life. Literally, the images of women's faces were painted black. Women were the first to experience all the restrictions imposed by the new regime. There are limitations of the girls' access to education, women's freedom of movement, access to work, healthcare, and sports. Representation and active participation of women and persons from minorities in all areas of public and political life. Women who have been involved in cultural, social, and political activities are now at a particular risk. This situation is a challenge for the whole democratic community. Ukraine has actively joined humanitarian actions and conducted successfully the rescue operations. Our military evacuated almost 700 people. These are citizens of Ukraine as well as citizens of many other different countries, members of international human rights organizations, journalists of various media. One of those people who were safely evacuated to Ukraine is an Afghan film director, Sahra Karimi. Ms. Karimi is the first female chairwoman of the Afghan film and a director whose films are renowned beyond Afghanistan's borders. And it is extremely unfair and cruel that such talented people are forced to leave their country due to persecution. I support the ideas expressed in this report and call on my colleagues to take all possible measures to protect women's rights in Afghanistan. Thank you for attention and my congrats on this report. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur Frides pour la Suisse.
Merci, Madame la Vice-présidente. Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues. Mon propos va se partager en deux aspects. D'abord des questions humanitaires, puis des remarques un peu plus politiques. Il y a effectivement beaucoup d'inquiétudes à avoir quant à la situation humanitaire que traverse actuellement l'Afghanistan. On fait référence à des problèmes de famine, notamment, tout à fait dramatiques. Et il est vraiment important pour moi de tenter de garder un contact avec les talibans pour assurer la poursuite d'une aide humanitaire grâce au CICR notamment. Et je sais que des sommes très importantes ont été récoltées dans ce but. Le deuxième élément concerne le recul sociétal massif qui menace ce pays et tout particulièrement la situation, le sort réservé aux femmes qui, ces dernières années, avaient réussi à prendre une place dans la société. Et là, malheureusement, on risque de voir un retour en arrière cruel, brutal et inacceptable. Troisième élément, les problèmes migratoires. Il faut tout faire pour protéger les Afghans qui sont hors du pays, qui sont chez nous. Certains, par exemple en Suisse, devaient être renvoyés. Mon pays a pris les mesures qu'il fallait pour leur assurer un maintien sans délai de protection en Suisse. Et je pense que la plupart des pays ont fait la même chose. La commission d'immigration, ce matin, a pris la décision à l'unanimité de demander en fait au bureau d'être saisi d'un rapport pour traiter de cette question des migrations et de ce suivi, car manifestement, on s'attend à de grandes difficultés dans ce domaine. Maintenant, des remarques politiques. Ce qui vient de se passer est pour moi le signe que les États-Unis ont décidé de ne plus être les gendarmes du monde et de se concentrer plutôt sur leurs problèmes à eux, voire sur la région Asie-Pacifique. Et je pense que les pays européens doivent penser peut-être à repenser la défense européenne. C'est un grand sujet. La Suisse étant neutre, je n'en dirai pas plus. Deuxième élément, je vous rappelle qu'au début des années 2000, plusieurs conflits en Afghanistan, en Irak ou en Libye ont été réglés dans un premier temps par des guerres éclairs basées sur l'écrasante supériorité militaire d'une coalition d'États occidentaux qui bénéficiait surtout d'un contrôle total de l'espace aérien. Donc victoire initiale facile, puis ensuite le début des problèmes. Le début de ce qu'on appelle maintenant les guerres hybrides, la guerre du faible contre le fort. Et c'est ce qui s'est passé en Afghanistan. Un vaincu invisible, parfaitement intégré dans le milieu, se fondant dans la population et attaquant l'occupant par des actes terroristes, par la guérilla, avec assez rapidement une déstabilisation de l'occupant. Ça a été encore aussi très net en Irak, avec des pertes humaines. Toujours plus de moyens doivent être mobilisés. On engage matériel et hommes. À la fin, c'est le découragement. À la fin, les pays en question, leur population se posent des questions sur l'utilité de l'engagement, le prix de cette guerre. On va vers l'enlisement avec de plus en plus de morts mal acceptés. Et ces États restent déstabilisés. Et aujourd'hui, on a un pays qui est en ruine, un pays divisé. Et on a effectivement, comme l'a dit avant Paul Gavan, pas beaucoup progressé. Donc c'est important d'avoir une approche globale des conflits et de ne plus utiliser les guerres du passé.
Merci, messieurs. Je passe la parole maintenant à monsieur Yildiz de Turquie.
Colleagues, after 20 years of US-led NATO operation, assisted by other also non-NATO countries, after all this operation, Taliban is now in the control of the entire country, Afghanistan. However, the risk of an internal conflict is still there. Sudden collapse of the previous Afghan government, recognized by the international community, did not lead to a massive migration as feared yet. Nevertheless, an economic meltdown in Afghanistan may trigger such an exodus, especially in view of the fact that more than 3.5 million people were internally displaced. On the other hand, out of a total population of 38 million people, more than 18 million of them in Afghanistan are currently in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Taking into consideration the recent developments, mobilizing international relations in order to further support and protect the people has now become of emergent requirement. Of course, the success of our efforts to support the Afghan people does not only depend on our actions. The current authority in Afghanistan should also do its part. They should ensure smooth access of humanitarian aid, as well as safe and secure operation of the humanitarian community in the country. Considering the humanitarian support that Afghans need, a certain engagement with the Taliban should be maintained. On the other hand, it is clear that the extent of international engagement with Taliban will depend heavily on the choices made by them. We have to be realistic and pragmatic. Recognition is one thing, but engagement is a necessity for addressing humanitarian needs, countering Daesh and other terror organizations. The dire humanitarian aid and economic situation in Afghanistan may lead to further radicalization and terrorist organizations as Daesh-K to gain ground again. In this context, filling the formal authority vacuum and an inclusive government are critical to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Keeping the channels of dialogue open and guiding the Taliban towards establishing an inclusive political system and government is the most appropriate course of action in the current circumstances. International community must also give consistent messages and speak one voice to the Taliban on the need to avoid Afghanistan becoming again a safe haven for terrorists. In summary, Madam Chair, the right approach, I think, and to Afghanistan at this stage, let's try to stay engaged, empathetic, pragmatic, and with smart conditionalities. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Yildiz. Je donne la parole à Monsieur Ispan d'Espagne, mais je ne l'ai pas vu. Est-il là? Une fois, deux fois. Non, il n'est pas là. On passe donc à Monsieur Goncharenko pour l'Ukraine. C'est à vous, Monsieur.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dear colleagues, I would like to address to you and to say that, yes, we need all to say thank you very much for Rapporteur for great work, and that was really extremely important. And Ukraine was also not far from this situation. We took part in it. We evacuated almost 1,000 people from Afghanistan. Our special service people, servicemen, Ukrainian military men, they helped to take people from the most dangerous places in Kabul and to make them safe. And it's our common responsibility to help these people today. But what should be the lesson for all of us? After all we have seen in Afghanistan, and we should understand that the problems, they only start now. And we all need to take some lessons from what had happened. And I think that the most important lesson is that we need to be strong. We, European countries, need to be strong. We really need to be a player, or we will be played by somebody, by some other players. And that's why we need today to have active international policy. We need to have European armed forces.
which will be ready to respond on the challenges which we see. We saw recently the big military movements of Belarus and Russian army on the border with Poland, Lithuania and Latvia, whether we are ready to fight there if there will be some problems. I'm not so sure. We cannot rely only on the United States, which we saw recently can absolutely be inside their own country and their own problems. And we need to be strong ourselves. In other case, we will have big problems. For example, now we understand that one of the biggest challenges from Afghanistan will be migration flow and many migrants. And we saw now how, for example, Belarus regime, Mr. Lukashenko, is weaponizing migrants right now on the border with Lithuania, Latvia and Poland. And we cannot react in really strong way. That's the problem. More than 1 year we have problems in Belarus. And what is done by Council of Europe? For the moment, nothing. We had several debates and that's all. We raised the question to have permanent body or committee in our organization on Belarus, and still we couldn't do this. So the lesson from Afghanistan is the next. The world is global. We cannot be inside the shell of our countries, 47 countries, and say everything is okay, we have good economy, and we have our internal problems. No, it will not work like this. So we need to be strong. We need to be prepared to respond to such hostile activities. Thank you.
Merci, messieurs. Je passe la parole à Madame Soumelzo pour l'Espagne, si elle est là. Non, donc on passe à Monsieur Tornaritis pour Chypre, s'il vous plaît.
Dear President, dear colleagues, I should like first to thank the rapporteur, Sir Tony Lloyd, for his report, which highlights our main concerns as regards the recent developments in Afghanistan. We have all witnessed the tragic and disturbing images and the pressure and anxiety thousands of people have experienced fleeing the country. Our main aim should be to protect human life and fundamental human rights, ensure freedom and dignity for all, access to education and culture without discrimination, and respect for the country's rich cultural heritage. However, we must turn our words into specific action. Particularly, we must uphold women's and girls' fundamental rights and freedoms, and support and build on the progress achieved in the past 20 years. We must also protect other vulnerable groups and engage creatively with the Afghan society to meet current challenges. We are ready to engage with the present regime if it respects and meets these basic principles. We must provide humanitarian assistance and relief to the people suffering both within and outside the country, and ensure that their basic human rights and dignity are safeguarded along the way. Thank you very much.
Merci, messieurs. Nous allons encore prendre Monsieur Slutsky de la Fédération de Russie en ligne. Vous avez la parole, monsieur.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Je viens parler en russe. Дорогие коллеги, постараюсь быть кратким. Ситуация чрезвычайно чувствительная. Движение талибов ведет себя в русле победителей, и это правда. Они победили в этой войне, и сложно было бы от них ожидать соблюдения всех тех норм и правил, которые существовали ранее. Поражение потерпело бывшее правительство и все международные силы, которые его поддерживали. Это произошло по целому ряду причин. Это и коррупция, и неэффективность данного правительства, это отрыв от реальных нужд афганского народа. Я довольно долго имею дело с Афганистаном и работал с обеими палатами афганского парламента в разное время. Если сравнивать поведение военно-политической группировки талибов с тем, что было 20 лет назад, очень много перемен. Мы вместе с коллегами из других стран, в частности из Китая и Пакистана, планируем установить контакты с руководством талибов, которые выступают в качестве временного правительства Афганистана. И надеемся, что они учтут наши позиции, в том числе и сегодняшнее мнение нашей ассамблеи. Но необходимо выстраивать с ними контакты и не навязывать им какие-то внешние, в том числе европейский менталитет, ценности и культурные традиции. Мы имеем место сейчас с демонстрациями протеста в Кабуле и некоторых других городах Афганистана, но мы, дорогие коллеги, должны понимать, что в городах живет только 20% афганского населения. В Кабуле никто не знает, сколько точно на сегодня проживает в стране. И, конечно, коллеги, думаю, что с учетом того, что в Афганистане продолжает работать мобильная связь, если бы были мощные факторы притеснения, об этом бы все благодаря мобильной связи практически узнали. Сегодня все центральные телеканалы страны работают в том же самом режиме. Они не сообщают антиталибскую информацию, они подают сбалансированно и точку зрения Талибана, и иную точку зрения. Это сам по себе обнадеживающий фактор, который мы должны учитывать. И если мы хотим реально помочь афганскому народу, нам не стоит увлекаться только тем, что нужно вывозить его представителей, надо помогать народу на месте, в стране. И не только критиковать методы общения талибов с женщинами, мы этим ничем им не поможем. А если присутствие неправительственных организаций, посольств, таких как посольство России на месте, будет давать нам некий положительный фактор, я бы поставил этот фактор на первое место. Мы сейчас видим некую активность ИГИЛ в Восточном Джалалабаде, других местах. Мы следим за развитием ситуации и думаю, что сегодня очень своевременная дискуссия. Самым разумным и гуманным подходом мирового сообщества и Европы в целом к Афганистану было бы устанавливать контакт с талибами, вести с ними предметный диалог и методом убеждения, а не диктата или санкционного давления, побуждать их постепенно менять внутреннюю политику с тем, чтобы облегчить участие афганского народа, судьба которого для всех нас не безразлична. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, merci beaucoup, chers collègues.
Merci, messieurs. Je dois maintenant interrompre la liste des oratrices et orateurs. Les oratrices et orateurs inscrits qui, présents dans le débat ou connectés à distance, n'auraient pu s'exprimer peuvent, dans les 4 heures, transmettre leur intervention dactylographiée au service de la séance pour publication au compte-rendu, sous réserve que les orateurs connectés à distance puissent faire état de leur présence effective au moment où le débat sera clôturé. Cette transmission doit être effectuée par voie électronique. Monsieur le rapporteur, vous avez maintenant 3 minutes pour répondre aux orateurs. C'est à vous.
Madam President, can I first of all thank the Secretariat for their incredibly hard work over these few days in preparing for me this report, which I think has been widely accepted as a very good basis for us to continue our conversations about Afghanistan. I'd also like to thank colleagues generally, because I think it's true to say that the compassion that we've heard mainly across the debate this morning, it reflects both well on this assembly, but reflects actually what we should be talking about. And how do we help? What do we do to make life better? And it's clear to me that the primary issue, making sure that humanitarian aid gets through, food, obviously, healthcare, obviously, are of paramount importance. And these, as the United Nations General Secretary said, should not be conditional, and that's right and proper. But I do want to, if I may, enter a few areas of controversy. There was a debate, I think Monsieur Lenné was part of it, and he rightly made the point that we shouldn't recognise the Taliban. We do not recognise a government that comes to power by force, but we have to deal with the Taliban. And we look to the United Nations primarily to be the first interlocutor with that government in Kabul. Because actually what we've got to prevent is the instability in Afghanistan that will massively impact on the people within Afghanistan, the 3.2 million already internally displaced and others, more refugees, but also to prevent the growth of the drugs trade, to prevent the possibility, the real possibility, that this becomes again a breeding ground for terrorism. Terrorism against possibly the Taliban, terrorism against who knows where else in the world. So those are real issues in which we have a premium that we must place on helping to bring about stability. And yes, my friend Piero Fassino is right to say that this must be conditional. It's not wrong for us to say that if we're going to give development assistance, it will need that level of conditionality. This is what we should be about. And I've got to say this, there is no such thing as European values. There's no such thing as Western values being imposed. It's not a Western value that says a woman doctor should not be prevented from going to work. That is ludicrous. That's a nonsense to put this. It's not a Western value to say we don't kill people because they're gay. These are not Western values. These are universal values. Actually, they're part of what we sign up to in the United Nations. So we need to be very clear in our dealings. We need to be very cautious, very careful in our dealings with the Taliban. Yes, of course, we have to work with the Taliban. That's absolutely right. But cautiously, carefully, not recognition, but a practical level that says, how can we help? Humanitarian aid, yes, development, where we can achieve that. And in the end, let's try to make sure that we're part of stabilising the people and the communities of Afghanistan. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci, monsieur. Est-ce que monsieur le président de la Commission souhaite répondre? Je vous en prie, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to congratulate to our rapporteur and also to the Secretariat for this extremely well-balanced text we have got in front of us. And I would like to ask to all of you to vote in favor. The United States in the Doha Agreement more than 2 years ago signaled all this. So it was not a surprise to anyone that the departure is going to take place. But the way it happened was a disaster, it was a failure, and it was a disaster and failure for all of us. And now we need to investigate the geopolitical shift and what comes for the European Union and the Council of Europe as a consequence out of this. It is an important question, and we have started to consider this. And the word in the text concerning the cooperation with Taliban writes operational engagement. I think it is very well put, Mr. Rapporteur. There needs to be an operational engagement to manage internal matters, especially to stop the danger of the reoccurrence of terrorism. And the other dimension which in report is very important and crucial is the regional approach. Neighbors are crucial. We are going to manage in the next coming years a very serious crisis, humanitarian migration crisis, and the neighbors will have a special burden. I think the European Union points out very well that we need to concentrate on the neighborhood as much as we can. So the military departure should not be a political departure. That is probably the most important conclusion. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de la Commission. La discussion générale est désormais close. Pour le projet de résolution, la Commission des questions politiques et de la démocratie a présenté donc un projet de résolution sur lequel 6 amendements ont été déposés. J'ai cru comprendre que le président de la Commission des questions politiques et de la démocratie souhaite proposer à l'Assemblée de considérer l'amendement numéro 2 qui a été adopté à l'unanimité par la Commission comme adopté par l'Assemblée. Je précise que l'amendement numéro 1 a également fait l'objet d'un vote à l'unanimité, mais ayant fait l'objet de sous-amendements, il sera examiné dans les conditions habituelles. C'est bien cela, Monsieur le Président? Est-ce qu'il y a des... Ok, merci. Y a-t-il des objections? Il n'y a pas d'objection, donc l'amendement numéro 2 sur le projet de résolution est déclaré adopté définitivement et nous en venons à la discussion des autres amendements. Mes chers collègues, je vous rappelle que le temps d'intervention pour chaque amendement est limité à 1 minute. Ils seront appelés dans l'ordre dans lequel ils s'appliquent au texte tel que publié dans le recueil des amendements. Nous en arrivons donc d'emblée à l'amendement numéro 2, qui a été adopté à l'unanimité, je le précise, mais on en reparle puisqu'il y a un sous-amendement. C'est le 1 ? Alors attendez. Non, c'est le 1. C'est l'amendement 1 qui a... Oui, pardon. Donc l'amendement numéro 2, pardon, je me suis trompée de fiche, a été adopté à l'unanimité. On passe donc à l'amendement numéro 1 et à 2 sous-amendements oraux. La parole est à Madame Marta Grande pour soutenir l'amendement numéro 1. Non? Ah, c'est à vous.
Sì, grazie Presidente. Questo emendamento va ad introdurre un concetto molto importante, ovvero quello della tutela degli studenti afghani che sono già iscritti nelle università dei Paesi membri, ed è fondamentale perché abbiamo visto in più Paesi mobilitazioni da parte delle stesse università, da parte dei colleghi studenti, proprio perché alcuni di questi ragazzi sono rimasti bloccati in Afghanistan e tramite questo emendamento potremmo riuscire a farli tornare nei Paesi membri e continuare quindi il loro percorso di studi.
Donc, la présidence a été saisie par la commission du sous-amendement oral numéro 1 suivant. Donc, écoutez bien. Il faut remplacer à l'amendement numéro 1 les mots « après le paragraphe 8.3 » par les mots « avant le paragraphe 8.12 ». L'amendement ainsi sous-amendé se lit par conséquent, je cite, « Dans le projet de résolution avant le paragraphe 8.12, insérez le paragraphe suivant ». En vertu de l'article 34.7a du règlement, le président peut, à titre exceptionnel, déclarer recevable un sous-amendement oral s'il estime qu'il est destiné à apporter une clarification, à tenir compte de faits nouveaux ou à permettre une conciliation. Je considère ce sous-amendement oral comme recevable au regard des critères du règlement. Il ne peut toutefois être pris en compte si 10 représentants ou suppléants au moins s'y opposent. Dans ce cas, veuillez vous manifester, les présents en levant la main, ceux participant à distance en demandant la parole. Nous devons vérifier que l'objection a le soutien requis de 10 personnes. Donc, y a-t-il des objections à la prise en compte de ce sous-amendement oral? Il n'y en a pas, en ligne non plus. Nous allons donc examiner ce sous-amendement oral. La parole est à Monsieur le rapporteur pour soutenir le sous-amendement oral.
Thanks once again, Madam President. This is, in one sense, a technical sub-amendment. It first of all moves the wordings into the right place in the resolution, the most appropriate place. I think colleagues will understand why that's there. It also introduces the word Afghan, so introduce visas not simply for students, but introduce visas for Afghan students enrolled in universities of member states. So I think this is about clarification of the amendment, and I hope it is helpful to the Assembly.
Très bien. Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre le sous-amendement oral? Non, en ligne non plus. L'avis de l'auteur de l'amendement sur le sous-amendement oral? Madame Grandet, peut-être?
Sì, accettiamo la riformulazione.
L'avis de la Commission est naturellement favorable. Donc, nous allons procéder au vote de ce sous-amendement oral numéro 1. Le scrutin est ouvert. Donnez-le-moi. C'est bon chez vous? Pardon. Le scrutin est clos, pardon. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le sous-amendement oral numéro 1 a été adopté à l'unanimité avec, 4 abstentions, mais adopté largement, bien sûr. La présidence a été saisie par la commission du sous-amendement oral numéro 2 suivant. Insérer à l'amendement numéro 1 le mot « afghan » après le mot « étudiant ». L'amendement ainsi sous-amendé se lit par conséquent, je cite, « à mettre en place un système de visa pour les étudiants afghans inscrits dans les universités d'États membres ». Je considère ce sous-amendement oral comme recevable au regard des critères du règlement. Il ne peut toutefois être pris en compte si 10 représentants ou suppléants au moins s'y opposent. Dans ce cas, je vous remercie de vous manifester, les présents en levant la main, ceux participant à distance en demandant la parole, pour vérifier s'il y a une objection. Il n'y a pas d'objection. Nous allons donc examiner ce sous-amendement oral. Monsieur le rapporteur.
Thank you, Madam President. For the reasons I already outlined, this simply is a clarification of the intent of the amendment.
Je vous remercie. Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre ce sous-amendement oral? Non. En ligne non plus. Avis de l'auteur de l'amendement sur ce sous-amendement oral, s'il vous plaît, Madame Grandi.
Sì, siamo chiaramente favorevoli.
Donc, l'avis de la Commission est naturellement favorable et nous allons procéder au vote du sous-amendement oral numéro 2. Je déclare le scrutin ouvert. C'est bon chez vous? Très bien. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le sous-amendement oral numéro 2 est donc adopté. Nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 1 sous-amendé. Le scrutin est ouvert. C'est bon, le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. L'amendement numéro 1 sous-amendé a été adopté. Nous passons à l'amendement numéro 3. La parole est à Madame Petra Bayer pour soutenir l'amendement numéro 3.
Thank you very much. Amendment 3 is driven by the fear that public awareness will focus on regions where media is present, and that could lead to ongoing marginalization of vulnerable people in rural areas, and we must not forget about people there, and that's the reason for.
Merci. Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre cet amendement? En ligne non plus? Personne? L'avis de la Commission, dans ce cas, s'il vous plaît. Favorable. Nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 3. Le scrutin est ouvert. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage. L'amendement numéro 3 est adopté. Nous passons à l'amendement numéro 4. La parole est à Madame Bayer pour soutenir l'amendement numéro 4.
Yeah, to protect human rights, especially in very critical situations, is not the cherry on the cream, but substantial for democracy and rule of law. And that's the reason why we want to mention especially vulnerable groups like minorities, women and LGBTIQ people.
Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre cet amendement? Pas dans la salle, en ligne? Non plus. L'avis de la Commission, s'il vous plaît, sur cet amendement? Avis favorable. Nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement. Le scrutin est ouvert. C'est bon. Le scrutin est clos et nous allons voir l'affichage du résultat. Amendement numéro 4 adopté. Amendement numéro 5, Madame Bayer, c'est toujours pour vous.
Yes, by witnessing the readiness of other countries for their responsibility to protect the most vulnerable population, you can also measure how serious they take it with their human rights. And it's a matter of fact that minorities, women and LGBTI people are among the most vulnerable in Afghanistan. That's the reason we want to include that wording.
Quelqu'un... Oui, je vous en prie, Monsieur Yilmaz, vous prenez la parole contre cet amendement?
Yes, Madam Chair, with all due respect to Ms. Bayer, I think the original text is comprehensive enough in showing our enthusiasm in protecting everybody's human rights. When we take into consideration the situation in Afghanistan, these amendments even may backfire. Let's be realistic. We remember what happened on Istanbul Convention discussions. That's why we should be realistic and empathetic. I don't think that original edition of this text will serve any purpose better than the original text. Thank you.
Quel est l'avis de la Commission?
In favor.
La Commission était pour. Nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 5. Le scrutin est ouvert. Nous attendons la fin des votes en ligne. C'est bon. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage des résultats, s'il vous plaît. L'amendement numéro 5 a été adopté. Nous passons maintenant à l'amendement numéro 6. Madame Bayer.
Yes, there is not a single situation existing where it is okay to neglect the needs for temporary protection for people most in need, and there is no doubt that women, minorities and LGBTIQ persons are among them.
Merci. Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre cet amendement? Monsieur Yildiz, je vous en prie.
I will not repeat my remarks. It is the same issue that I just remind the colleagues that we are talking about Afghanistan. The situation is well known. Let's be realistic. Thank you.
Quel est l'avis de la Commission?
In favor.
Favorable. Nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 6. Le scrutin est ouvert. La technique, ça y est, le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. L'amendement numéro 6 a été adopté. Nous allons procéder maintenant au vote sur le projet de résolution contenu dans le document 15-381. Une majorité simple est requise. Le scrutin est désormais ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le projet de résolution contenu dans le document 15-381 a été adopté. Merci, monsieur le rapporteur. Alors, nous avons droit à quelques minutes de pause, car vous avez bien travaillé de manière très efficace. Merci.
Good day, dear colleagues. Some of us will be heading out of the committees, Mr. Minister. Next item of business this morning is the address by Mr. Nikola Dimitrov, Deputy Prime Minister for European Affairs of North Macedonia. This will be followed by Q&A, as we call it. Of course, any question can be put to you, Mr. Minister, but you, of course, own your answers. You're politicians, and sometimes you answer something that you have to say, but we know that. Anyway, I wish to welcome you warm-heartedly. I think the timing is quite appropriate. You have informed me that the head of the European Commission is still in the region, if I get it right, and next week might be an important moment concerning the future of the Western Balkans as a whole and North Macedonia more specifically concerning the relationship with the European Union. Of course, we are not the European Union, but we do have a lot of member states within our realm, and we do represent the greater Europe of which you are part. It is timely, but at the same time it is basically long overdue, because as we have seen, I mean, it must have been, what, 15 years ago since we really thoroughly, as for the Parliamentary Assembly, addressed the issue. Of course, dialogue and partnership with our member states is of the highest importance. We have a long-standing relationship of cooperation, but I think that we should accelerate the activity of this assembly and maybe of the organization as a whole, but that's not for me to decide. But certainly of this assembly with regard to the relationship and the future of the Western Balkans as a whole and North Macedonia more specifically, which is why I think it is interesting to listen to you, given the fact that after this part of the session we will have a current affairs debate on the Western Balkans. So without any due delay, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I wish to welcome you and deliver your speech, how they call that, which will be followed by a Q&A. Thank you. You have the floor. Yeah, you can come from... in French, they say au pupitre. I haven't got a clue. I mean, there are words in English, but I don't know which. No, I know, but like pupitre, it's a bit more elegant. Merci. You have the floor.
Dear Mr. President of the Parliamentary Assembly, the setting is such that I'm turning my back to you. But we see you there. But it is with respect and friendship. Madam Secretary General, distinguished Assembly members, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a major honor for me to be here to address the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for the second time. I was here in 2018 in a different capacity as a foreign minister, so this is my second opportunity and privilege to address you. This time, I think I have to underline how grateful we all are in the region for the initiative of the Parliamentary Assembly to have a debate on the European future, on the European perspective of the Western Balkans. This debate comes at a great time, I think, because it coincides with the end of the visit of the European Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, to the region. Her message in all capitals was, do not lose faith, your future is European. It also coincides with an article from Reuters that made headlines throughout the Balkans that member states do not longer have consensus to repeat the promise that was made 18 years ago at the European Council in Thessaloniki in 2003, a promise that is still yet unfulfilled. Few days after today, next week, There is a summit between the EU and the region, and we'll see what the declaration, what the messages of the EU will be towards the region. I know that this organization, as a cradle of democracy, of human rights, of rule of law, is very much part of the same vision. And when we reform and do what we need to do at home to be in line with the Copenhagen criteria, we rely and are very grateful for the cooperation with many of the mechanisms of this organization, including GRECO, the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, the Venice Commission, the Horizontal Facility, etc., etc. I'm going to try to make the case for my country, for North Macedonia, but also for the region. And I'm going to appeal for responsibility and leadership in the capitals of the region and the capitals of the European Union, that it is really high time to move forward. I've never done this. I was silent for 16 seconds, not because I lost the train of thought. This is to illustrate the 16 years that my country has been a candidate country since 2005, and we are still not able to start their journey. So North Macedonia is probably the most drastic example from the wrong side of things of the accession policy of the European Union. We started the journey after Slovenia and before Croatia. Croatia marks 8 years of membership in the European Union, and we still haven't started the journey. The reason for these lost generations was not lack of reforms. It was not because we were part of the Yugoslav wars, because we were not. It was a problem that we had with a neighbor, a problem that we resolved in 2018 with the Prespa agreement. This was highly praised by the whole democratic world as a triumph of democracy, of diplomacy, of reconciliation. It was arguably one of the biggest dispute resolution effort and success after the Dayton Agreement in our region. Prespa agreement was preceded by an important agreement for friendship and cooperation with another neighbor, with Bulgaria. It is not only the lost generations and the passage of time that makes us a strong candidate. It is also what we did at home in terms of continuously improving our democracy and our society governed by the rule of law. In all of the reports of the European Commission, but also many other important organizations, we are in a small group of countries, regrettably today, that makes a democratic progress. Also, I think the most recent was the Global Peace Index. We are the 5th country in the world with biggest progress in terms of predictability and stability and peacefulness. So it's really time to move forward. The obstacle that we have in front of us and this misunderstanding that we have with our neighbors in Sofia, with Bulgaria, is not territory. We do not have a territorial dispute. It is not something that has to do with reforms at home. It has to do with issues of history, of identity, and of language. And I think it's really high time for both countries to assume responsibility and leadership and find a way out of this, because this really takes a deep toll on the friendship between the two nations, and it disrupts important European policies in our region. The natural state of play should be that our neighbors will be our biggest champions, because they have the most to gain from a European success of North Macedonia. In 21st century Europe, the issue of languages, this Sunday, I think we marked the European Languages Day as designated by this organization, by the Council of Europe, a day where we celebrate our diversity on the European continent. The issue of my mother tongue, the Macedonian language, should not be in contradiction with the efforts of the nation to move forward on its European path. Not if Europe is a continent where we cherish linguistic and cultural diversity, as it is written in the Lisbon Treaty, and as we cherish and celebrate in this organization, in the Council of Europe. And this is why I argue that this struggle is not only a struggle for my own national identity of my people, but it is also a very important struggle for the European identity as well, for the soul of the European Union. Who am I and what language do I speak is not a matter where others should have a say, other countries or other organizations. The right of self-determination, of self-identification is something very intimate, and it is mine. In a democracy, I do not allow my own country to tell me who I am, let alone third countries. What we did with Bulgaria in the Friendship Treaty was we said we're going to enable and create a positive climate for historians to discuss historical issues, and we, as politicians and governments, will work on what we can change. And what we can change is today and tomorrow. This plan, the approach of the Friendship Treaty, has been derailed and in contradiction with Article 2 of the Friendship Treaty, where it says that Bulgaria will assist our efforts on our way to the European Union. Instead, it stopped our journey by blocking our path for 2 times now. In the long run, I think this significantly undermines the relationship, and I think we are in a status quo where we have losers throughout the region. In Skopje, in Sofia, it resonates throughout the region because other countries are also losing trust that this is actually possible, seeing that what North Macedonia has done, which is admirable for the last several years, it's still not enough for Europe to say, you delivered, we will deliver. So I think this is where we are, and this is a moment where we have to assume responsibility. I grew up as a diplomat resolving problems. And what I've learned is that you have to understand and you have to be able to think in the shoes of the other if you want to resolve a problem. You have to clearly know the concerns of the other party and find a combination of issues where the concerns of your nation are met, but also the concerns of the other party as well met. And in this, if we introduce the context of European values and principles, then we have a sustainable solution. Resolving a dispute between 2 nations always costs political credit. You cannot have a success if you don't spend political capital. We did it once to some extent twice. And in many ways, we did it because of the next generation and not the next elections. Sometimes people realize that and reward leadership, sometimes they don't. But in the long run, I think it's important that what we do today will put us, talking about history so much, on the right side of history when others will observe what we have done. We live in a world where patterns, organizations, alliances, geopolitics cannot be taken for granted. All of the organizations, all of the patterns of the international relations are now more shaky and less predictable. And this is a time where we have to assume responsibility. The region of the Western Balkans, whether we like that name or not, is composed of 6 countries surrounded by member states of the European Union. Geographically, we are like a room in a European house, but not on the borders of the house, somewhere within. And we are not plugged in. We are not plugged in the water plant, in the water systems, in the electricity, in the air conditioning. To have this room not part is not good for the whole house. It's not good for the room, it's not good for the whole house. We are a region that trades with the common market for over 3/4. We are a region where all investments come from European companies for over 3/4 as well. We are a region that is critically important for the EU's own stability, be it organized crime or fighting terrorism or the migration crisis of 2015 and 16. If Europe loses the trust of the people, that their future, the trust of the people in the Balkans, that their future is with them, Europe risks losing this region. And after so many years of no progress, our last biggest progress was Croatia in 2013. It is really time to think hard. And if this world is now a world where more geopolitical players compete for power, and if the European Union is serious about doing its role and in its place, it should think twice whether it is more costly to lose the Balkans or to invest and make the Balkans properly European so that there are democracies there, there are independent judges there, where media are free, and when there is economic prosperity. All this is possible, but we will need political leadership. It's really difficult for me. My portfolio is, and I don't want to talk too much because I'd like to have a lively debate, so I'm going to be concluding soon. For me, as someone who is in charge of European affairs for my country, I really struggle when I talk to the people, to the citizens, explaining this constant cycle of hope and disappointment. And we've been going through this constant cycle of hope and disappointment, in particular, since June 2018. At that time, Bulgaria was actually a huge advocate for the start of the accession talks of my country. The issues were different. It took a new methodology to bring other countries in the consensus, and now we have, regrettably, this problem with our neighbor. It's really time to show to the region that the European Union is serious about its promise of Thessaloniki. And this unfulfilled promise takes a toll. It makes pro-European forces weaker, and it makes other forces, probably more nationalistic, stronger. If we lose the European vision of the region, other more sinister visions will come into play. And I think we witnessed what can happen when there is a competition of greater ethnic state, etc., from the 90s. I think this was a civilizational defeat for our continent. I appeal to European leaders to reiterate and send a strong political signal from the summit in Slovenia that the future of this region is European. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you so much for the debate that will follow after my address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Two additional pieces of information. One, we've got about 50 of our colleagues online. This is a hybrid session, just for you to know. And secondly, this is an information for the people online and in the room. I have been informed that today is your birthday, so happy birthday. Unfortunately, we don't have a tradition that now someone comes down with a big pie and a candle, but we'll think about it in the future. If you would have warned us up front, maybe it would have happened. Anyway, we head into our Q&A now. I will take the questions 5 by 5, which allows you, Mr. Minister, to address them in a fashion that you see fit. In principle, we first have the representatives of our 5 political groups, followed by individual members. So we will take 5 questions as a whole together, after which I will gladly yield the floor to you again to address the issues that have been mentioned. I recall to our colleagues in the room and online that the time you have is 1 minute, and I do urge you to ask a question instead of making statements. I say that all the time, but it never happens all the time. But still, so I'll say it again. A question is more useful than a statement, although you never know that the statement might be seen as a question. First on my list is Mr. Hadžuković. Domagoj, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy birthday, Mr. Dimitrov. After Dayton Accords, Prespa Agreement is probably the most important treaty solving one of the crucial issues in the Balkans region. In your view, how would you stimulate similar solutions to other pressing issues in the region? And we see, for example, tensions in Kosovo, if EU does not follow through on its promises. And I have a second question. The 2019 European Court of Human Rights judgment obliges North Macedonia to adopt a law allowing for legal gender recognition in a fast, transparent and accessible procedure. The draft law on civil registry, which would introduce legal gender recognition based on self-determination, is currently blocked at the face of parliamentary commissions. How is the government working to ensure that the draft law on civil registry is unblocked and proceeds towards a vote in the parliament? And how is the government working to build support for this law? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move to EPP. Jolt Singer-Zaran. Jolt, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Happy birthday, Excellency. I have 2 short questions in the name of EPP. We highly appreciate the very significant legislative and minority policy measures taken over the last 2 decades with regards to the improvement of the situation of Albanians and the peaceful Macedonian-Albanian coexistence. We would like to know, how do you see the situation of the smaller national communities in North Macedonia now? And the second one, how could the Council of Europe and its member states help to the country's further democratic reforms and European aspirations? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nous passons maintenant la parole à Jacques Maire au nom de ALDE. Jacques, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et naturellement, bon anniversaire à M. Dimitrov, cher Nicolas. Très heureux d'abord d'apporter tout le soutien du groupe ALDE aux efforts faits par la Macédoine du Nord, notamment à travers l'accord de Prespa que nous célébrions ensemble il y a quelques semaines, et l'accord d'Ohrid auparavant, qui ont effectivement permis d'éviter une guerre dans les Balkans qui a fait des morts dans bien d'autres pays. Une petite question sur l'Europe que vous projetez. Nous avons bien vu récemment un sommet concernant la démographie qui proposait une voie européenne bien particulière avec de nombreux responsables des Balkans. Il me semble que la Macédoine du Nord affirme des valeurs démocratiques profondes, une volonté de changement, une volonté d'intégration et de convergence. Dans ce contexte, aujourd'hui, qui est assez débattu en Europe, finalement, quel est le projet européen que la Macédoine du Nord défend quand elle veut se rapprocher et quand elle souhaite s'intégrer à l'Union européenne, c'est qui est évidemment le souhait profond de l'ensemble du groupe ALDE. Merci.
Merci, Jacques. I now go to John Howell on behalf of the EC. John, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Europe is not the same as the European Union. You have been a member of this Council since 1995. Would you like to say what you have done to strengthen the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, and therefore what role we can play in making sure that you become more European?
Thank you, John. Last in the row is George Katrougalos for United Left. George, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, dear Nikola, you have tried your best. You have pushed reforms. You have tried to resolve the disputes with your neighbors, beginning with the friendship treaty with Bulgaria, then with the historic Prespa agreement. And you paid an important political cost for that. The European Union does not seem to reciprocate. We read yesterday in Reuters that our union will not guarantee anymore the future accession of the Western Balkans. Does your population feel frustrated, betrayed by this behavior? And what are your major fears for the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Prime Minister. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'll take them as they were questioned. So I'm going to start with the lesson learned for others in terms of whether disputes in the region will be solvable if we take the European narrative out of the equation. And I think what we have witnessed with the renewed tensions on the border of Kosovo and Serbia is actually one signal. For us, the European context was an incentive. And many European leaders, when they came to Skopje to campaign and called the people to vote yes at the referendum to confirm the Prespa agreements, in a way promised that this will mean the start of the accession talks. So the lesson for others in the region will be, if this promise remains to be unmet, the lesson for others will be, is it worth doing this? Some say it openly and on record. Look what Europe did to Zaev. Why would I do this? So I think without the European context, resolving the remaining issues in the region will be increasingly more difficult. On the concrete question on the judgment related to gender recognition, yes. I think the issue has been resolved for the individual applicant in question, for the citizen in question, but the systemic solution, of course, will take a legislative amendment. The government adopted it, it's in the parliamentary procedure, and talking to the Minister of Justice, I think we foresee its adoption in November. We are now in campaign for local elections. Parliament is not fully functional in that respect. The tone in the public discourse is such that I think it will be difficult for those who are not fully convinced among the members of the Parliament not to support this amendment. So the plan is to have this done in November this year. On the issues, there was a question on minorities, especially the smaller communities. North Macedonia is a multi-ethnic society, and we see it as a strength. We have a tradition of tolerance. In part, this was strengthened by the Ohrid Framework Agreement. We marked 20 years since its signing, an agreement that introduced equitable representation in the public administration, language rights, more decentralization, and the government actively promotes a policy called One Society for All, or One Equal Society for All. Regardless of our ethnic backgrounds, we are in a common house, and we have common successes and we have common challenges. I think the society has moved to an extent where the issues that are pressing concern mostly non-ethnic issues. In many ways, the multi-ethnic agenda of the country, you can never say this is done. You can never say we did it, now we can move on, and it will always take engagement and attention from the society, from the country. But by and large, the issues that the country faces, let's say the fight for more economic prosperity and better education and more justice and more accountability, are values and processes that unite all ethnic communities, bigger and smaller. We also have a tradition of deciding together, in part regulated using the so-called Badenter majority principle. So when there is a political decision to be made that touches upon issues of ethnic communities, they should be part of the decision making. And there should be a majority also of those representing the ethnic communities in question. There was also a question, how can we help? You're helping a lot, also that's related to the question, and apologies for that, because this is the pressing pain. This is why I talked more about the EU. And the way we see the European Union is not unrelated to the values and the processes of this organization. For the region, for the citizens of the region, when you say European, the word brings positive associations of democracy, of freedom, of having your rights respected, of having equal opportunities, of decency, of normalcy, of economic prosperity. And the bulk of our reforms to become more European are very much in line with the principles of this organization. When I say you already help a lot, I refer to the Venice Commission. This is an instrument we use very often when we amend legislation or have dilemmas, and we try to align with the European acquis, with the European standards. Greco as well. Now we have local elections, so I'm seeing many polls of the public opinion. When you ask the people their number one concern, this is justice and fight corruption. So in this respect, Greco is extremely important. Then I think the projects supported through the horizontal facility, the Council of Europe has an office in Skopje. I think this is also very helpful. So in terms of the narrative of values, I think the two organizations are very much part of the one vision for our continent. The frustration. There was also a question, what have you done on democracy, on rule of law? First of all, we've had a steady stream of really free and fair elections. So I think we have that pretty much covered. We work closely with this organization, but also the OSCE to make sure that this is not an issue. We changed the way judges are appointed, and in many ways we did everything that we can to use the blueprint of an independent judiciary. There is an atmosphere in the country that everyone must be accountable. We've had steady judgments against former holders of power, but also current holders of power, which is extremely important. On media freedom, I think we are doing very well, and I think this is noted in all the reports of the Reporters Beyond Borders and many others. And we learned it hard way. We had a crisis of 2015 and 16, where the state then, under a leadership that had obviously autocratic tendencies, tried to control the media. So at that time, the state, using taxpayers' money, was the biggest advertiser in the media sphere, holding almost up to 60% of the media market. What we did was we said we will not use taxpayers' money to advertise. There was a big debate whether we should do it to promote the vaccination campaign, and we find ways to do it other ways, and we didn't do it again. So with all our deficiencies and issues, North Macedonia today is actually a very vibrant democracy where media are free and everything is reported. We also made progress on anti-discrimination. We had a legal system in place. The previous government amended that. We brought it back so that anti-discrimination clearly applies also to sexual orientation and gender identity. So the country is moving in the right direction, and I think what's most important, it is because of the society. The people are pushing. The people have learned that when they make a stand and are loud, the political parties, political decision makers follow. Lastly, on the frustration, people do feel betrayed, and I think in many ways, because the promise of the government was based on the European promise, the government is struggling as well. The narrative is not complete, and the promise is not met. So I don't think there is an alternative to becoming European. I think it's easier to do so if you have the reform tool of the accession process, but having it or not having it, we're going to stick to the plan to make North Macedonia a functional European democracy governed by the rule of law. Of course, when Europe doesn't deliver on its promises, it will lose the trust, and it is losing the trust, and it will lose the leverage that it has in this region that is geographically in its midst. So thank you, George, for your question. I think we all feel the same, because we were part, also the two of us, we were part of this process together. I believe we will make it in the end, but we live in a world where the right thing to do is not always done. I think, and I hope that I covered the 5 questions that were raised.
Thank you. We will now move to the 3 following one. Laima Andrikiene, Ahmed Yildiz, and Piero Fassino online. So please make sure that Piero is asking for the floor. We start with Laima. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Dimitrov, it is a pleasure to see you among us. I recall my work in your good country in June and July of last year, when I was leading ODIHR election assessment mission for your parliamentary elections. Of course, we all are aware that North Macedonia and Albania are ready to start accession negotiations with the EU. Unfortunately, the start of the Intergovernmental Conference was postponed again and again, and it is not fair. I would like to take this opportunity and to appeal to our Bulgarian colleagues. North Macedonia and Albania will be members of the EU, and it is our common interest to have them in the family sooner rather than later. North Macedonia has done a lot and has sacrificed a lot in order to be ready for the accession talks. Bulgaria is well aware of that, and I encourage Bulgarian authorities not to block EU accession talks with North Macedonia. Western Balkan region is still full of tension. In recent days, tensions on the Serbia-Kosovo border were observed, and our sincere wish is that they return to dialogue. My question to you, Mr. Dimitrov, how your country is influenced by tensions in the region I just mentioned, and what we as the Council of Europe and its Parliamentary Assembly could do to contribute to your European perspective. Thank you.
We now move to our colleague Ahmed Yildiz. Ahmed, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, as you know, Turkey and Turkish nation has a good perception about the Macedonian identity because descendants of the Macedonian immigrants still play very positive, essential role in Turkish economic and political life. And also, there's a considerable Turkish minority in Macedonia living in peace with their cultural rights. You are a diplomat, I am a diplomat. I know from my service in Sarajevo, my country did everything to support, first of all, the transatlantic track of Balkan nations. Congratulations on your membership in NATO. Also, we declared several times Turkey supports the European Union membership of all these countries, even if the Turkish accession is not in stalemate. But there is some parliamentarians here thinking still that Turkey has an anti-European agenda in Balkans. Did you see any such attitude from Turkey harmful to any nation in the Balkans? Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move to Piero Fassino. Is he online?
Pronto, sì.
Voilà,
intanto auguri al primo ministro. 2 domande. La prima, io condivido il sentimento di frustrazione e di delusione che nei Balcani c'è e che anche il vice primo ministro ha manifestato, perché è passato troppo tempo. Sono passati 26 anni da Dayton e sono passati 18 anni da Salonico e l'integrazione europea è ancora lontana. Quindi io credo e sono d'accordo che bisogna assolutamente accelerare. Allora la mia domanda è: oggi l'adesione della Macedonia del Nord è bloccata dalla Bulgaria. Che iniziative sta assumendo il governo macedone per favorire una soluzione del contenzioso con la Bulgaria e sbloccare quindi il veto bulgaro? E la seconda domanda è: come valuta il vice primo ministro il problema migratorio che investe i Balcani e come la Macedonia lo affronta? Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Prime Minister.
Thank you for, I think, the very important questions. This time I will do it the other way around. I'll start with the last one. First of all, on migration. I don't think this is an easy there is an easy fix. The way to stop people leaving is to make sure that they have good conditions for a European way of life at home. And this is not only jobs and salaries, it's also a perspective that the country is moving in the right direction and that the future will be brighter 5 years from today, 10 years from today. It's also about what people care, about justice being done. So rule of law is also part of it, about, especially in COVID times, but also without COVID times, having good hospitals, having good schools for the children. So I think the way to do this is to focus and deliver and have a realistic long-term plan. You can't do this overnight. You can't even do this in one democratic term. But I am convinced that the whole region can do this in the next decade to somehow revert this trend. Otherwise, we will be failing the next generation, essentially. When North Macedonia became independent, I was coming out of age, 18, 19 years old. 30 years later, I still don't think that we have made it, at least for the next generation to have a better start than my generation. The whole region is, I think, facing this challenge together. I don't think there is an easy fix. Sometimes politicians talk about building walls. Even if we build a wall around the whole region, we won't stop young people leaving unless we make better conditions for them at home. And the European perspective is part of this. On the question on Bulgaria, and I would like to thank the deputy from Mr. Fassino from Italy for making this motion for a resolution to have the Parliamentary Assembly support the European future of the region. I think this is an important signal in a time where these signals matter and are desperately needed. So I very much support the initiation of designating a rapporteur and looking forward to reading the report, the resolution and the recommendations in this process. With Bulgaria, there are elections, parliamentary and presidential. We are committed to continue to try to find an understanding, also bilaterally, on issues where we can find an understanding. I think the stakes are really immense for our friendship, for the future of the region, for the people. The effect of the policies of the last 2 years are such that in the polls, Bulgaria is seen as a problem, as a troublemaker. When you ask the citizens whether they think that another country creates a problem for them, for their nation, Bulgaria is by far the first one. And among the friendly countries, it continually decreases. So I don't know about the polls in Bulgaria, about North Macedonia, but I think we have to realistically look at what we are doing, because I think because of history that we cannot change. History is very important. We are all proud of our history. The history that we create today must be something that people will be proud of. And this is more important than, because today we can change it. So this is what we are trying to do. We can't really talk about who we are. No country can tell us who we are. This is a self-determination, this is a self-identification question. We can't talk about our language.
This is not decent to do in 21st century, I'm sorry. On this continent, in 21st century, it is not good neighborly to tell your neighbors, but your language is this or that. It's not something you do. And a solution must make sense from the perspective of the European values. Otherwise, it won't be a solution. How can you build friendship if you use a position of leverage and you bully your neighbor on issues that are so intimate? You can't build friendship. And we start a process that is extremely important, but this now is derailed. And I am honest when I say, not exactly because of our fault. Turkey, thank you for your kind words on our NATO membership. The question is whether I don't think, if I understood the question right, I don't see any negative influence in terms of our European aspirations and work coming from Turkey. We've enjoyed traditionally good relations. We are not always looking on the issues from the same perspective, which is, I think, something normal and natural. But I cannot say that there is a disruptive attempt or policies coming when it comes to this effort for European integration of the region. And then I also thank you and all the kind words from Lithuania and from you personally. I come back to this resolution. I think the very fact that there is a debate today on this topic from the European perspective is actually very helpful. The timing is great. And please engage so that there is a resolution. And in a way, you help those European forces that realize it's time for action. This is my response on what is it that you can do. I'm also, I remember a meeting in Skopje when you were heading the other mission, and I think you can probably confirm what I said on the free and fair elections in North Macedonia. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take 3 more questions. First, by Elvira Kovac, then Rafael Husseinov, and then Ekaterina Gecheva-Zaharieva. I hope I said that one right. So we'll start with Elvira. Elvira, have the floor.
Thank you. Dear Deputy Minister, it goes without any saying that regional cooperation is a pillar of the European integration process, and that the Open Balkans initiative contributes towards the achievement of this goal. And I believe that we could all agree that from Novi Sad, the birthplace of Mini Schengen initiative, in October 2019, to Skopje, in July this year, the cradle of the Open Balkans initiative, with November 2020, when the Sofia Action Plan for the Common Regional Market was adopted, a new era of the Western Balkans cooperation has begun. It is obvious that due to the limited economic potential of any regional cooperation in the Western Balkans and the lack of EU membership perspectives, in order to boost regional economic integration, the EU needs to come up with a realistic plan. Do you believe that the plan should include an offer for the Western Balkans to join the EU single market in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Thank you, Elvira. We go now to Rafael. Rafael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear Deputy Prime Minister, your country also took part in the International Agricultural Exhibition, which opened in Izmir, Turkey, in June this year. It is clear that such platforms are also a good place to build foundations for future collaboration. Ministers of Agriculture of your country and Azerbaijan discussed the prospects for cooperation there. In particular, what opportunities do you see for expanding economic relations between your country and Azerbaijan in this area and in other areas? Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. And then finally we come to Ekaterina. Ekaterina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy birthday, Nikola. I can assure you that Bulgaria is still one of your biggest advocates for your European Union perspective, but because we are not in European Council, but of Council of Europe, my questions are linked with democracy and human rights. There are numerous of cases of different types of pressure, including harassment, intimidation, and even hate crimes against citizens of the Bulgaria in the Republic of North Macedonia with Bulgarian self-identification. There is also a significant growth in the number of media publications, which include hate speech coming from politicians, representatives of public institutions, directed towards Bulgarians. There is a big number of public plates and signs which directly equate the Bulgarian nation to fascist. What concrete measures is your government taking to address those worrying trends? And I think it's really important, so let me finish. Because it's in the context of Council of Europe Resolution 1481 from 2006 on need for international condemnation of crimes of totalitarian communist regime. What measures has the Republic of North Macedonia undertaken to rehabilitate the victims of the communist regime who have been victimized for their Bulgarian self-identification, and how state facilitate public access to archives of the former totalitarian services? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you for the questions. I'll try to be brief because I think we are over the planned 1 minute over, so not too bad. On Open Balkan, I think regional cooperation is obviously extremely important. We are a region of 18 million people. There are many borders. The less important those borders we make, I think the better off for the region and its economic attractiveness as a market and as a place of region of doing business. The question is, I think, very legitimate that came at the end after you in a way discussed the Open Balkan initiative, whether integration should start first by joining the single market. And I think thinkers, think tanks have been raising this issue, noting that we have no results from the enlargement policy, from the accession process. So I think it's a legitimate debate to discuss whether the region should first join the single market. I think the more we cooperate regionally, the less we will have tensions and problems, and because common interest will prevail. So whether it's through the Berlin process, whether it's through this initiative, I think it makes sense for us to make our countries more connected. There are too many trucks waiting on the borders. We need to take down those barriers for trade. We need to increase the trust between the different institutions from the region. We suffered from fires this summer, and other natural disasters are, with the climate change, frequently happening. So the agreement to organize ourselves in a way that when there is a country hit, we all run to help is obviously something that is quite sound. thank you for the point from Azerbaijan, and I'm glad to hear that there was a contact, there was a meeting between the ministers for agriculture. We are very proud of our agricultural products, so I think this and other areas, there is potential definitely to cooperate more. And finally, to Katya, to Ekaterina, raising several questions. I'm going to be also very open and honest here. First of all, when I checked, we have in the country a commission against discrimination. When I checked whether there are complaints to see if this allegation of human rights in this context. I know about other cases that are here, but not against North Macedonia. So I struggle to see if these allegations, because I hear them very often publicly on record from Bulgarian politicians, is this part of the domestic context? Is this really a bubble where this is really believed? We are a country that is multi-ethnic. We have it in our constitution and in our political tradition that ethnicities, everyone is equal, and that we're in this together, and we have a common house. Not all countries in the region have these policies, by the way, towards. We don't really have an issue in recognizing or not recognizing minorities. We think this is a question for the people concerned. If they feel there's something separate, then they're entitled to a certain set of rights, individual and collective. We now have a census. It ends today. It's been a while. I did it 2 days ago. I had people in my home, and they asked about my ethnicity. There was no list to choose. I was free to say. So, frankly, I think we should definitely meet and have an honest discussion about this, but the volume of allegations that somehow we discriminate and not having one complaint is a problem. And if this is a matter of domestic politics, maybe I can understand, but I really struggle to see how this will be fruitful for what we started doing, which is facing history, accepting reality, and working together to build a common European future. This is and then on hate speech. For me, hate speech, first of all, official holders of office, I don't think there is one illustration of that. In the previous Bulgarian elections, there was a TV commercial of one political party that portrayed North Macedonia as a Bulgarian land. This is territorial pretensions, and this I could interpret it as hate speech. So I think we should also, and when you, let's say, the increase of the anger, what you define as hate speech coming from our side, from the private people, from the citizens, is exactly triggered because you tell them who they are, you want to tell them what their history is, and you want to tell them what their language is. And naturally, people will revolt. And we as a country will always condemn incidents. But the current Bulgarian policy towards North Macedonia is an investment in antagonism, not in friendship. And my last point, because we are in this organization, in the Council of Europe, we are very much supportive of the initiative for the Observatory of History Teaching in Europe. I think part of the issues or big part of the issues between our countries is about history and about history teaching. I think it will help us if you also join this initiative so that we can learn from comparative examples and how this was done when other countries had issues of historical narratives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Indeed, the first thing you have to do is to try to do something together, in a positive way, obviously. Thank you for that. We will now head into our next item of business, which will be led by Laima, one of our vice presidents. You are obviously welcome to stay for the debate, because I do think that it might be useful and interesting for you to take on what our colleagues have to declare or discuss during the current affairs debate. I thank all of the colleagues for their questions, specifically also our Bulgarian colleague. I think it is important that this might be just a start as a good dialogue to take on in the future and to solve some problems in the Western Balkans towards also the relationship with the European Union, although we are not the European Union. But if we can be a platform to help, why wouldn't we do that? Thank you very much, and please stay. You're welcome.
Dear colleagues, the next item of business this morning is a current affairs debate on the Western Balkans between democratic challenges and European aspirations. What role for the Council of Europe? The speaking time is limited to 3 minutes for all members except the first speaker chosen by the Bureau, who will be allowed 7 minutes. And our debate will end by 1 p.m. In the debate, I call first Mr. George Papandreou. Mr. Papandreou, you have 7 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, for this very important discussion. In 2003 in Thessaloniki, I had the honor as Foreign Minister to prepare the summit between the Western Balkans and the European Union. We agreed then on a historic document, and I'll read you the most salient points. The EU reiterates its unequivocal support to the European perspective of the Western Balkan countries. The future of the Balkans is within the European Union. We all share the values of democracy, the rule of law, respect of human and minority rights, principles fundamental to both the European Union and the Council of Europe. Organized crime and corruption is a real obstacle to democratic stability, the rule of law. Combating it constitutes a major priority. Fragmentation and divisions along ethnic lines are incompatible with the European perspective, which should act as a catalyst for addressing problems in the region. We reiterate that a rapprochement with the EU will go hand in hand with the development of regional cooperation. This roadmap developed concrete benchmarks to safely guide the countries of the region to European Union membership. The prospect of membership in a common family of European values provided enthusiasm and the impetus for change in these countries. It brought hope that peace finally would be embedded, replacing conflict, and that democratic rule of law would reign, replacing authoritarianism, persecution of minorities, and human rights violations. Prosperity would be the common goal, uniting former foes in a beautiful kaleidoscope of ethnic diversity and traditions. This vision was to bring closure to the Balkan tragedy of the 1990s. And in fact, it is this prospect that has been a strong catalyst for much change in our region. And important progress has been made, as the Deputy Prime Minister has said. The most recent example is, of course, what Nikola has described. A compromise was found between Greece and North Macedonia. The Prespa agreement was not easy. It took courage from both sides, and Nikola and his government showed great courage. It was painful for both sides, yet the prospect of cooperation within a European family gave both the political leverage to make this difficult leap. Happy birthday, Nikola. Since then, the EU has done too little, too late. It is time for the EU to accelerate the integration process by relaunching the negotiations with Serbia and Montenegro establishing them with Albania and North Macedonia, granting candidate status to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and liberalize entry visas for Kosovo. This is of utmost importance as the European vision and values are losing their shine, and their place is taken by nationalism, which is resurfacing. A trend not exclusive to the Balkans, nationalistic and xenophobic sentiment is found in many corners of Europe, if not the world, possibly due to similar reasons: failure of global cooperation to effectively deal with issues of inequality, social protection, population movements, health and environmental crises. However, there is an important difference in the Western Balkans. The wounds of bloody conflict are fresh. The history of the Balkans has often been of proxy wars, fueling ethnic division, dependency on protector powers, and weak institutions feeding clientelism and corruption. As the European prospects wane, it is no wonder we are seeing a new geopolitization in the region, with third parties again vying for influence and also fracturing the region. And reverting to nationalism and cynical transactional foreign relations is an easy task for demagogues. It risks reopening past wounds and conflicts. For those in the EU who point to these as reasons to stop accession, as was mentioned in the recent article in Reuters, and Mr. Dimitrov and others have mentioned, I state the opposite. These are exactly the reasons we must step up the process. And for those governments that have recently circulated non-papers promoting the redrawing of borders on the basis of ethnically clean countries, I warn, do not open up this Pandora box. In fact, they want to continue where the Yugoslav wars stopped and further promote mono-ethnic or ethnically pure states. This final solution, this dystopia, caters to the worst of demagogic xenophobia. It undermines any sense of conviviality in the Balkan Peninsula and undermines our core values of respect for diversity and tolerance in an ethnically diverse Europe. It could lead to new massacres and bloodbaths. As a citizen of the Balkans, I know that our hopes and visions were never of conflict and hate. In fact, a famous freedom fighter, Rigas Fereos, even wrote up a constitution in the early 1800s where he saw all ethnicities could live together in peace and under democratic rule. That is what the European prospect is all about. Reveling in our diversity, respecting each other's dignity and rights, building good neighborly relations, cooperating for our common prosperity. This vision, of course, would continue to survive even if it was that we did not have any European Union or Council of Europe. That is what also Nikola was saying. We will fight for these values. We need to fight for these values, whether we have the European Union or the Council of Europe. However, and that, of course, would mean that we would be up just to the Balkan peoples. And we need to work together as Balkan peoples to fight for these values. However, the European perspective is a guarantee that this vision can become a reality, and that is the reality we want. Dear colleagues, this Assembly can make a major contribution if it rekindles the hope for a European perspective for the Western Balkans, if it formulates recommendations to the authorities concerned, and it further uses its capacity and expertise, the Venice Commission, Greco, Greta, Grevio, for institutional reforms, as were discussed earlier, and raises its voice against all those who do not believe we can live together in beautifully diverse societies. Beautifully diverse societies, of course, as long as we remain united as a family of values, values which are underpinned by democratic institutions, the rule of law, and respect of human rights. Let me close by repeating what you said, dear Nikola. We have a lot of history. We must learn from it. But today, we want to be proud of the history we will be making today and for the future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papandreou. We come now to our speakers list, and first of all, I will call colleagues who will be speaking on behalf of political groups. And our first speaker is Mr. George Katrougalos, who will be speaking on behalf of the European United Left group. The floor is yours, please.
Madam Chair, Dear colleagues, let's admit it. Europe is failing in the Western Balkans. It is failing its promises, its values of openness and inclusiveness. The accession of the Western Balkans looks today more far away than at the time of the Thessaloniki summit. Actually, farther away than ever, despite the aspiration of the peoples in the area and the promises given by the European Union. Make no mistake, it was never an easy endeavor. First of all, we had the weight of the past. Balkans used to be the powdered keg of Europe. The last European war in European soil was exactly there, the tragedy of the 90s in former Yugoslavia. And it continues to be an area of latent nationalism, of confrontation between states and within states regarding minorities. And we know other problems, of course, domestic ones, embedded corruption, weak structures of the rule of law, a lack of parliamentarian tradition. But let's be frank, we knew of these problems. The same problems had the Balkan countries which have joined the European Union. And the countries in the area try to conform to their obligations. They are trying, of course, with mixed results, to be closer to the institutional average. Some of them, like North Macedonia, have tried to resolve, showing big political courage, all remaining disputes with their neighbors, beginning with Bulgaria, continuing with the historic Prespa agreement. Both governments of Prime Minister Zaev and Prime Minister Tsipras needed to show a lot of political courage towards this direction. And it was not just a treaty that concerned bilaterally the two countries. It was a clear sign that problems can be resolved through dialogue and with respect of international legality. European Union did not reciprocate. And the problems are obvious. The vacuum, as Nikola has said, left by the Europe is now occupied by other non-European forces. There is frustration and disenchantment by the political system, and a whole generation lost with the democratic losses. This impasse should end. The hope must return. North Macedonia's accession should be a priority, as well as this of Albania, if it resolves the remaining issues with its historical Greek minority. Negotiations with Serbia and Montenegro should relaunch, and serious discussions to start again with Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is a duty of all of us to contribute towards this direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katrougalos. Our next speaker is Piero Fassino, and he will be speaking online. The floor is yours, Mr. Fassino.
Grazie, concordo totalmente con la relazione di Papandreou e lo ringrazio, e credo che bisogna partire da una considerazione molto semplice. Sono passati 18 anni da Salonico, sono passati 26 anni da Dayton e l'integrazione è ancora lontana. Questo sta determinando nella regione delusione, frustrazione e si attenua l'aspettativa di questi popoli, di questi paesi verso l'Unione Europea. E ritornano le antiche nostalgie. Quel non-paper che qualche mese fa è stato diffuso nei Balcani, nessuno lo ha rivendicato, ma qualcuno lo ha scritto e qualcuno lo ha diffuso. Ed è un non-paper che ripropone la disarticolazione di tutto quello che abbiamo costruito in questi 26 anni e riafferma il disegno degli stati etnicamente puri, dell'etnocentrismo, del nazionalismo più violento. Allora, dobbiamo impedire tutto questo e questo significa che l'Unione Europea deve essere consapevole che occorre superare l'impasse in cui siamo. Io mi auguro che il vertice del 6 ottobre determini una spinta vera verso la ripresa del processo di integrazione, riprendere i negoziati con Serbia e Montenegro, aprire finalmente il negoziato con Macedonia del Nord e Albania, dare una prospettiva riconoscendo lo status di candidato alla Bosnia e affrontare anche il problema del rapporto con il Kosovo. Bisogna che su questo l'Unione Europea esca dalle ambiguità, perché ogni ambiguità non può che determinare frustrazione, delusione e ritorni indietro. E noi sappiamo che tutte le crisi che scoppiano nei Balcani poi investono sempre l'intero continente europeo. L'Unione Europea ha anche un altro dovere, non solo quello di riprendere i negoziati, ma di dare segnali forti di inclusione. Per esempio, i vaccini sono arrivati in Macedonia, in Serbia e in Albania perché li ha forniti la Russia, li ha forniti la Cina, li ha forniti la Turchia. È assurdo. Dobbiamo chiedere che i Balcani occidentali siano ricompresi nello spazio di approvvigionamento dei vaccini dell'Unione Europea. Così come la proposta che ha avanzato la van der Leyen di un nuovo patto sull'immigrazione e sull'asilo, bisogna coinvolgere su questo i paesi balcanici, perché è lì che passa la rotta balcanica, una delle rotte, diciamo, dei problemi dei flussi migratori. Così come lo sforzo finanziario che l'Unione Europea ha fatto per mettere a disposizione risorse dei paesi balcanici bisogna che sia orientato nella stessa direzione in cui si sta lavorando con il Recovery Plan e il Recovery Fund per facilitare la convergenza economica tra i paesi balcanici e l'Unione Europea. Insomma, è tempo di una svolta e il Consiglio d'Europa può dare una grande mano, accompagnando i paesi balcanici nelle riforme che l'Unione Europea chiede. Però deve essere chiaro che se l'Unione Europea continua a rallentare, questo induce anche nei paesi che devono fare delle riforme la tendenza a rallentare. Quindi il problema non è quello di diteci quando fate le riforme e poi noi vi diremo quando entrate. No, il problema è accelerare il processo di integrazione, perché questo accelera anche il processo di riforma di quei paesi, che può essere accompagnato dal Consiglio d'Europa e dalle sue strutture, come ad esempio la Commissione di Venezia.
Mr. Fassino,
Grazie.
thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Fassino spoke on behalf of the Socialist Group, and now I call Mr. Alexander Pochi, who will be speaking on behalf of the EPP-CD political group. The floor is yours, please.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues, Monsieur le Président, situé au cœur de l'Europe, au carrefour des civilisations, la région des Balkans occidentaux a été marquée au cours des siècles passés par des conflits, avec notamment les conflits nés de l'éclatement. Les Balkans produisent plus d'histoire qu'ils ne peuvent en absorber. 30 ans après, cette région connaît encore de fortes tensions, des enjeux majeurs pour l'Europe. Il me semble que l'indépendance des pays balkans et des bonnes relations avec les pays voisins sont là pour la stabilité de ces régions et pour le futur de ces régions. L'adhésion des pays des Balkans à l'Union européenne est à la fois un devoir moral, mais aussi un impératif géopolitique, économique et social. Sinon, nous risquons de décourager ceux qui ont accompli d'importants efforts. Il y a aussi l'enjeu démographique, avec les risques d'une fuite massive de la jeunesse et un déclin démographique. Le Conseil de l'Europe a aussi un rôle important à jouer pour apaiser et encourager les réformes, notamment en matière de démocratie, l'état de droit et la lutte contre la corruption, aux travaux de la Commission ou encore à la diplomatie parlementaire. Au niveau de la jeunesse que nous parviendrons, il nous faut donc un engagement fort, très fort, de l'Union européenne et du Conseil de l'Europe pour la région des Balkans de l'Ouest. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pochi. I call next Stephanie Crisper, and she will be speaking on behalf of
Thank you, dear Mrs. President. Phrases are used in high quantity. We talk about strengthening accession prospects, bringing the West Balkans to the EU. But what does prospects mean for a citizen of one of the Western Balkan states? Who struggle for a job, to the residents here who can barely breathe the air in their city. I believe we should focus our work and our work on the quality of life for every individual in the relevant countries. Yes, it is. It is about fighting poverty, creating economic opportunities, preventing environmental. And I'm convinced if we would make clear and concrete promises and deliver on them, which is already deteriorating, as also many speakers before me said, if we outside courtrooms and other places, instead of talking of perspectives and accession criteria, we would prove that we want also to win partners and not dependents in the Western Balkans. And we know that accession is not a purpose in itself. It also, some colleagues said, not the only actor in the region that is definitely here also focusing on economic. It is not unique in that sense. The Chinese have economic interests, the Balkans, in form the region into a place with a much higher living standard and with opportunities. And what does the Council of Europe do? It is the rule of law and human rights that is at the heart of Council membership of the EU. But in the same period, also some member states of the EU, even old member states, have started to deteriorate regarding rule of law and democracy. And this is bad for investment, partnership, and most importantly, for every individual citizen whose human rights are of these not guiding principles, not standards, but clear binding rules that should be supported to make clear what Europe is about and to defend and strengthen those who in all these countries want democratic society. And we should be clear with the West Balkan government partners here who are the citizens, and we are willing to support them and work together with governments and opposition projects like Venice Commission, like Greco, as we heard before from the North Macedonian President, Prime Minister. It is on us not only to tell people, but make them law and human rights mean for their lives and what improvements they could bring. I think this is the only way forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Crisper. I call next Lord Alexander Dundee, who will be speaking on behalf of the European Conservatives group. Please.
President, for more than 2 decades, all states have also become members of the European Union. The balance of countries are European Union candidates. The advantage of this process is enhanced political and economic stability for the EU. On the current scope for the Council of Europe to help the Western, encouragement to cross-border cooperation and partnerships between local authorities, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, necessary progress with standards and democracy. Coming from a Balkan countries to join the European Union, but I believe such membership and further integration will have a hugely stabilizing effect in political and economic terms. Yet the question is, what can the Council of Europe do about that? European Union democracy, human rights protection, and good governance. These are also the core objectives of the Council of Europe. Following the war in former Yugoslavia, the heads and government of our member states adapted Council of Europe prescriptions at the Vienna summit of 1994 for racism and intolerance. The Council of Europe has set several legal standards on the protection of national minorities, which are essential. Europe has also established legal guidelines and acted to promote local democracy. And of course, it is at local levels that democracy has to begin and first be seen to work. Over the past year, of human rights and the rule of law might have received more attention than on democracy. The challenges in the West Balkans that we must reinforce our work programme building up local democracy as a pillar of national stability. Secondly, cross-border cooperation. In this context, that between local authorities is particularly needed for attaining regional stability and economic development. In my own United Kingdom region, the has for several years good cooperation with the city of Zadar in Croatia. All colleagues look into their possibilities of initiating and supporting such city-to-city partnerships especially with the Western Balkans, and to convince their ambassadors here in Strasbourg to support such work by the Council of Europe. Our Assembly should also focus on democratic stability in Europe. Finally, Bosnia and Herzegovina attention. Being situated at an external EU border, Bosnia and Herzegovina bears several burdens, not least as being an end in the so-called Balkans route of irregular migration into the EU. The International Organization and the United Nations is doing excellent work in the country with strong support from the EU and some member states. More is needed, along with other West Balkan states, such as essential Bosnia and Herzegovina join the EU. However, to launch the process, further determined efforts must be made to persuade the adoption of Council of Europe standards by this country as a stipulated EU precursor. In discussing the Western Balkans today, let us think parliamentarians in our countries, as well as the Council of Europe as a whole, can be of help and relevant in particular ways to achieve political and economic stability in the Western Balkans. A helping hand can always do so much more.
Lord Dundee, I call next Ms.
Distinguished colleagues, the Western Balkan region is an integral part of Europe in every aspect. Our region is surrounded by EU member states from all sides. The Western Balkan countries do most of their foreign trade with the EU member states, then with and only then with third countries to a much smaller extent. All Western Balkan countries wish to be EU member state. The European Union, on its side, has also expressed the wish to make this region its integral part. However, over the last 2 decades, a very small progress has been achieved in this region's integration into the EU. A part of the responsibility for this certainly falls on the Western Balkan countries. Not all of us have shown readiness to reform our societies fast and determinedly. However, I believe that a greater part of the responsibility falls on the EU institution and policies pursued by some member states. Despite frequent announcements, the enlargement policy is not high on the EU agenda. In addition, the EU often changes the enlargement criteria. This significantly hinders the negotiation process, and even worse, it enables EU member states to literally blackmail Western Balkan countries on their path to EU for their own special interests. Thirdly, the EU loses its authority as it does not want to respond to open issues relevant for the overall situation in the Western Balkans, even in cases when Brussels is a signatory party to some agreements. The best example of this is Brussels Agreement signed by Belgrade and Pristina in 2013. For 8 years now, Pristina has not wished to implement the provision related to the establishment of the Community of Serbian Municipality, and Brussels has not responded to this, although it is the guarantor of the agreement's implementation. We get an impression that the EU does not want the Western Balkans to become its part, but considers this region a zone of its interest and wishes to affect all the developments in the Balkans. Therefore, just like Western Balkans should consistently carry out comprehensive reforms and meet the EU accession requirements, the EU also needs to tackle its open issue and speed up the enlargement as soon as possible. It should define the obligation and time limits for the enlargement countries. The EU should also step up its cooperation with the Balkans even further through various projects, thus ensuring greater connectivity and cooperation in the interest of states and citizens and the future of Europe. The Council of Europe, on its side, should facilitate the EU enlargement process by considering various global, local, and important issues relevant and the countries individually, and by acknowledging democratic and administrative capacities of the Western Balkans for meeting the Council of Europe's criteria for this member, which
Thank you very much, Mr. Obradovic, and I would like to ask all speakers to stick to the time. Each of us 3 minutes maximum. I call next Ms. Mariana Balic. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, enlargement policy is one of the most successful EU policies which promotes stability and prosperity. Also, it contributes to the promotion of European economy. My country, Croatia, joined the European Union on 1st July 2013, and since then, no other country joined the EU. Our successful accession demonstrates that the door should remain open to those who are able to fulfill all requirements and who are able to focus on united Europe. Now we need more efficient. We absolutely must welcome any progress made by the Western Balkans how to protect its interests, especially in the event countries in Europe. We'll continue to support the progress of these countries. Leaders of the EU member states, together with the leader of the executive, with significant financial assistance and EU enlargement. We cannot turn a blind eye to the existing violation of minority rights, media, safety of journalism, and intolerance. We have to assist Western Balkan societies in a strong tool in the hands of powerful individuals that allow them to maintain power without democratic control. Must be in conformity with the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights and domestic constitutional courts. Voting rights, fair representation of voters, including the legitimate of less numerous ethnic groups in multi-ethnic societies in the Western Balkans is only possible with an active, dynamic and credible policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Balic. I call next Mr. Mehmet Mehdi Eker. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President. Dear colleagues, despite some progress in addressing the regional and domestic issues and have a fragile stability, the current political deadlock in Bosnia and Herzegovina and recent demonstrations in Montenegro are examples of this fragility in case. We are all know that peace and stability in the Balkans have a direct impact on peace and security in Europe. And therefore, we should not let the Balkans lose its European Union perspective. However, up until today, we still see disappointment and uncertainty with European Union's failure to deliver on North Macedonia and Albania. The EU answer holds the region on its reform path. This is why Turkey itself and all 7 candidates to the EU. Besides, the EU orientation and the Council of Europe agenda essentially go hand in the region. EU perspective of the region should be credible and should be kept alive for the sake of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Countries that have made progress on this path should be rewarded properly. If we sustain the region's European perspective, the Balkans cannot overcome its chronic political problems. Finally, I would like to underline that Turkey is part of the Balkan neighborhood. Turkey has always been a supporter for the Euro-Atlantic integration of the Balkan countries. We have supported their membership in international fora, starting from the Council of Europe. We have the ability to talk to different sides in Balkans, and we will continue doing this for the stability and well-being of the region. Thank you for.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I call next Mr. Jacques Maire. The floor is yours, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Je suis un peu déçu par ce débat qui, finalement, se limite à bien sa propre part de chemin à faire. Et je pense qu'on ne s'en sortira pas comme ça. Le narratif de convergence, il est là. La réalité de l'impact de la déstabilisation des Balkans sur l'avenir de tous. On a vécu les guerres il n'y a pas si longtemps que ça. Et le bilan lui-même de ce qu'ont été les négociations d'élargissement dans les Balkans, au-delà des Balkans occidentaux et à l'est de l'Europe. La période d'élargissement est une période de contrainte. On souhaite partager le tiroir-caisse, mais on ne souhaite pas forcément partager les valeurs. Et évidemment, ensuite, ça pose énormément de problèmes. Je pense qu'il faut vraiment regarder concrètement pour remettre du capital politique dans cette négociation d'élargissement. Remettre du capital politique, ça veut dire prendre au sérieux ce qu'est le projet européen et ne pas être dans les intentions. De ce point de vue, la démarche de la Macédoine du Nord, qui a fait des arbitrages politiques très importants vis-à-vis de ses voisins, je dirais, est quelque chose. On rejette effectivement la responsabilité du retard, par exemple, de la négociation concernant l'Albanie et la Macédoine du Nord. En réalité, ce qu'on revoit, c'est à nouveau un problème balkano-balkanique depuis quelques mois entre la Bulgarie et son voisin. Et là, on voit bien qu'un État membre, lui-même, n'a pas vraiment intégré de l'Union européenne qui permettent cette convergence. Donc, cette nouvelle procédure de négociation, puisse être plus rapidement bénéficiaire de l'élargissement à partir du moment où une politique donnée a été négociée et où je veux bénéficier de l'Union européenne. Mais ce n'est pas que de la technique, c'est aussi de l'engagement politique. Il est difficile aujourd'hui, au sein de l'Union européenne, qui est elle-même divisée entre deux visions de l'Europe, d'avoir un débat effectivement détendu par rapport à cela, quand on ne sait pas certains pays candidats sont là pour renforcer l'Europe ou sont là pour contribuer à renforcer sa division. C'est pour ça que l'espoir et d'engagement qui sont ceux que la Macédoine du Nord attend doivent être donnés extrêmement rapidement pour donner la voie à cet élargissement nécessaire. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Mayor. Our next speaker is Josip Juratovic. But I do not see, he was supposed to speak online. I do not see him on oh, you are here. Very good.
Die Politik der Weltgemeinschaft beim Zerfall Ex-Jugoslawiens schwerwiegende Fehler begangen, aus denen wir heute lernen müssen. Das in der Helsinki-Akte vereinbarte Abkommen auf das Recht der Selbstbestimmung der Völker war ein Segen für Wiedervereinigung Deutschlands, jedoch für Ex-Jugoslawien Menschenrechte, verhindert Demokratie und schafft Nationalismus. Auf dem Westbalkan war eigentlich argumentativ zum Thema Einhaltung der demokratischen Grundrechte nichts mehr entgegenbringen konnte, sagte er, Kolleginnen und Kollegen, der Europarat muss in erster Linie seinen eigenen Vorsatz treu folgen, der in den Menschenrechten festgelegt ist. Das heißt, kein Handel mit antidemokratischen Verbündeten vor Ort, den Rücken zu stärken. Das bedeutet, Mittel mehr fließen dürfen, ohne dass sie die Demokratisierung in ihrer und konsequenter einfordern. Und das heißt konkret, erstens, in den betroffenen Ländern muss unser Hauptansprechpartner, das höchste Organ einer jeden demokratischen Grundordnung, nämlich das Parlament und die sich daraus ableitenden Institutionen sein und nicht teilweise die Parteigurus. Zweitens, wir müssen aktive Bekämpfung der Korruption in staatlichen Einrichtungen, beginnend bei der Justiz, sicherstellen. Und drittens, die größte Katastrophe des Westbalkans ist die Erziehung der Jugend im nationalistischen Geiste. Deshalb brauchen wir ein neues und gemeinsames Geschichtsbuch, in dem die Kriegsverbrecher als solche benannt werden, statt sie zu Helden zu sterilisieren. Kolleginnen und Kollegen, im Hinblick auf diese 3 Punkte wird vor allem auch unsere Glaubwürdigkeit gemessen. Und wenn wir schon bei Glaubwürdigkeit sind, möchte ich meinen Standpunkt zu EU-Beitritt Nordmazedoniens zum Ausdruck bringen. Was mir Sorgen macht, ist es, dass offensichtlich wieder mal ein einziges Land die Zukunft der Europäischen Union bestimmt. Somit ist dies nicht mehr das Problem Bulgariens und Nordmazedoniens, sondern ein ernsthaftes Problem der Europäischen Union. Konkret deshalb schlage ich vor, dass wir die Frage Bulgariens und Nordmazedoniens internationalen wissenschaftlichen Einrichtung einer Arbitrage bei Slowenien und Kroatien übergeben, Mazedoniens unter Gesichtswahrung aller. Vielen Dank.
Is Ms. Dubravka Filipovski. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I would like to make a few important points when it comes to the debate on the Western Balkans. EU also needs the Western Balkans, since the region surrounded by EU borders and countries aspiring to membership share common European values. Unfortunately, enlargement policy is not high on the EU agenda. For example, Serbia has been in this for a long time, and North Macedonia and Albania have not yet received a date for the start of negotiations. Movement of people, goods, services and capital to be playing together and accepting regional cooperation within various regional initiatives such as the Common Market, the Regional Schengen, Green Corridors and the Berlin Process in large investment that would not otherwise were possible for any of, and encourage our colleagues from the region to sign and implement similar that the vision of a common political and economic space across the Western Balkans will soon, through the single market, become an important part of the daily lives of many citizens. As for the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, I would like to emphasize that Pristina is not only request to this day the Association of Serbian Municipalities. We give up to talks because we believe that compromise is the only, will never recognize the independence of Kosovo and Macedonia, just like that have not done so to this day. Finally, I would like to point out that there are 26 national minorities living in Serbia. Legislation in Serbia guarantees through the work of national councils the exercise of rights in minority languages, rights in the field of education, in the official use of languages. We only ask that Serbs in other countries and countries in the region have the same rights as members of the national minorities in Serbia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Filipovsky. Dear colleagues, I see a long list of names on the speaker list. Unfortunately, I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The members on the speakers list who have been present physically and remotely during the debate not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that typewritten text, list of speakers, is interrupted. To decide upon a text, I thank all contributors to the debate. Very few announcements. The Assembly will hold its next public sitting this 3:30 p.m. with the agenda which was approved on Monday morning. Syrian girl in the form of